All right, check the mic. We're live. Day 2 of free agency. Going to hang out here for a while. Who knows how long? So welcome everybody. It's day 2. We'll react as things come in live here on the YouTube channel and see what happened earlier today. We got to review a little bit of yesterday, but today news. It was like it just all dropped at 8 a.m. right away. Javon Holland with a big deal, signing with the New York Giants, the Minnesota Vikings, spending a ton of money today and overall. 2 interior defensive linemen, Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave, the guards. We'll talk all about the Vikings. Daniel Jones signing with the Indianapolis Colts. But hi, Sam. Let's
what's up?
Welcome. We're gonna hang out here for a bit, see how it goes.
That's Sound impressive good? Branding you've got on there.
Go 33rd team.
Like front and center. It's like a little lower third, just all by yourself.
I am my own lower third. Yeah. Right there. Comfy. I enjoy the Jordan gear here. Comfortable.
Harrison will be pleased to know.
Harrison, shout out. I'm enjoying it. It's great. So tell your friends, come join. Check the mic. We're live here, talking day 2 of free agency. We'll discuss things as it breaks. We'll break the news right here. So let's start with the Vikings, man. They're spending a ton of money. They Jonathan Allen in, Javon Hargrave in, 2 of the better interior pass rushers in the NFL. Have some thoughts on that. In addition to yesterday's move with Ryan Kelly from the Colts, and then Will Freeze also comes in from the Colts. So center and guard from one of the better offensive lines for a ton of money. I mean, Ryan Kelly, pretty decent deal, 2 years, $18 million, but Freeze getting 5 years, $88 million. The guy was a fringe starter just 2 years ago and had a really nice 5-game stretch last year before hitting free agency right now. But either way, clearly an offseason goal of Minnesota to be better on the interior, both the offensive and defensive line.
Yeah, and I think definitely coming out of the way they lost in the playoffs, in particular against the Rams, where that offensive line was just overwhelmed, where Darnold was overwhelmed. Like that felt like a kind of a wake-up call. It felt like a slap in the face, right? Like, hey, this thing that has kind of been a weakness on paper for years, and you've been papering over it and hiding it and, getting by without it. Actually, it's quite a big problem. And that's the type of game where it shakes you and goes, okay, maybe that is a problem we need to solve. So I think the Vikings going after the interior of the offensive line this offseason made a lot of sense generally, and clearly that's exactly what's happening. I mean, this felt like the sort of backlash from Kansas City in the Super Bowl against Tampa Bay is always the best example of that, right? Where their offensive line was destroyed. And to be fair, it was a group of backups that was destroyed. So it wasn't even that logical. But immediately they were like, that's not happening again. Like, we are completely changing strategy to make sure we focus on that, rebuild that group so that does not happen to us again. It sort of felt a little bit like that for Minnesota. That interior in particular got wrecked, and they're like, no, we're fixing that right now. 2/5 of the Colts line, upgraded 2 of the 3 interior spots. The third one may well be on the way at some point this offseason. So I think Minnesota is definitely upgrading the interior of the offensive line. That makes a ton of sense. The surprising moves to me, though, were both of the defensive tackles. Either one of them makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's an area that's kind of needed some help for a while. Getting both of them is a pretty clear statement of intent.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, they're saying, by the way, I mean, the Bears went all in on their offensive line. So think about this: twice a year, all of the additions the Bears made on their offensive line going up against these additions on the Vikings defensive line, and vice versa. Just that matchup twice a year. We already know the Lions are strong on their offensive line and pretty good on their defensive line. So I mean, we've got some great matchups in the NFC North that are going to continue. Yeah, let's talk those 2 defensive linemen, Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave. You guys know we both came from PFF. Still believe in a lot of the data and the grades and the stories that the grades tell. Hargrave and Allen have been 2 of the best interior pass rushers in the NFL over the last couple of years. If you do look at their PFF run defense grades, they're not great, and it's rightfully so. I think like Allen is not a hold the point type of player. Hargrave is a interior penetrating type. He's never really been a great run defender, but when he got unleashed in Philadelphia a few years back, and then eventually in San Francisco, again, became one of the better interior pass rushers. So Minnesota, first off, from a pass rush perspective, with Brian Flores running the show. Last year, they bring in Andrew Van Ginkel and Jonathan Grenard off the edge. Those guys are fantastic. They drafted Dallas Turner in the first round. Now they add Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave. That just those 5 players and their ability, especially the way Turner can move around with his and Van Ginkel, the way those guys can move around with their athleticism. Good luck blocking that on third down. And then you have Flores running the show, and we know he's got no problem sending 5, sending 6, or dropping everybody and sending 3. Like he will mix it up. So the combination of the trickeration of what Flores can bring, but also it felt like Minnesota last year wanted to get back to, hey, if we need to rush 4, we can get home. Now they have one of the best 4-man rushes in the NFL potentially with those 5 guys rotating in and out.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes a really interesting group now. The question I think just remains so neither one of those guys, Hargrave or Jonathan Allen, are coming off their best season. Allen in particular, I mean, he got hurt and sort of made it back by the end of the season. He got hurt in what was termed, remember, a season-ending injury. Like he got hurt, whatever it was, week 6, week 7. And every article you find written about that was Jonathan Allen suffers a season-ending pectoral injury. That's usually done, shut you down, gone for the year immediately. He ends up getting back before the end of the season. Like he actually made it back before the end of the regular season, week 17, I think. Played a couple of games. And then, so number one, just getting back at the point where you're like written off as the season's gone is pretty impressive. In the playoff game against Detroit, I mean, you can make a case that he was the difference in that game. He was spectacular against the Lions, had a ton of pressure, had a ton of quick pressure as well, made some real impact plays for them. Now, that was kind of the only game that he did that in his return. But like at his best, Jonathan Allen has been one of the most disruptive interior pass rushers in the NFL. His best is a while ago outside of that one game against the Lions in the playoffs. You know, he's still only 30 years old. Like this is still in his prime, theoretically, but that's a lot of money for a guy who is, you know, coming off a down year in which he was injured. And we haven't seen the very best of him for a few years now. Like if the Vikings get prime Jonathan Allen, that's an absolute difference maker to this defense. If they get, you know, a diminished version, it might not be.
Yeah, I want to add more to that point too, because when I was talking about the whole run defense aspect of it, I think that's a factor, right? The run defense thing is a factor, right? You don't necessarily want players out there who are not great at holding the point, who are not just great in that aspect of the game, because you don't want to get run all over. But I think with Minnesota and Flores' defense, they use 8-man boxes more than most teams. They've had one of the better run defenses in the NFL over the last few years. So to your point about Allen and maybe getting some, you know, diminished role, I think if they just unleash him as a pass rusher at this point in his career, I say this every year in free agency, if you take an 800, 900 snap player and maybe make him a 500 to 600 snap player, I know the money's rich for Allen, maybe for 500, 600 snaps. To me, that's the best way to maybe get the best out of those players, limit the need to, you know, play early downs, especially with Allen in his age. So my point in all this is I think Minnesota may have found a bit of a schematic advantage, because again, if you use PFF and you go check out the run defense grades for both of these guys, you're going to say, wow, this is awful. Multiple years of awful for Javon Hargrave. But if the Vikings have that schematic advantage where they have 8 in the box a little bit more, their ability to kind of keep offenses off balance, have the extra man to make the play against the run, you could probably deal with lesser run defenders to let them bring what they're going to bring on third down. So that's what it looked like to me. Minnesota saying, we trust our run defense, everything else that we have around these guys. We trust Flores to be able to scheme it up to slow down the run games of, you still have to stop Detroit, right? You still have to stop their running attack, but they're saying these guys are going to help us on third down. These guys are going to help us on second and long. And we're going to trust the rest of the scheme, Flores and the other players, and the good run defense that they've had. So I thought that was an interesting move for Minnesota as well. They're saying, hey, we're getting after the quarterback no matter what.
I'm also curious whether, I mean, Hargrave now, look at you get snack delivery. This is, I don't know that. I had to go get my
I was in the middle.
Stuff.
I was in the middle of getting mad at him, and I've got, so we're here for a few hours, so I can eat a little bit, right? Like we're just hanging out, and
I mean, I'm not going to stop it.
I have an egg scramble here delivered from Benny.
Not only did I not get brought food by my child, but I had to get her breakfast this morning just to get her out of the house into school. This is a crock.
Then you have quiet for a bit. You've got.
That's true. I do get the silence of her being at school.
I never know when people are they're gonna break in over here.
That is a benefit. The Hargrave was interesting because earlier in his career with the Steelers, like I think he was actually a better run defender than he was a pass rusher. And then it was like he got to the Eagles and they went, don't even think about run defense. Don't concern yourself with that. All we're interested in you doing is shooting gaps, getting into the backfield, penetrating, causing disruption. And his like run defense grade at PFF went from like high 70s, low 80s to like 30s. Like almost overnight. It was like they completely changed the type of player that he was. And then that carried over into San Francisco, where I think they said, look, what you're doing in Philadelphia is great. We want that. Just keep going. I'm kind of curious if there's ever a point or ever a different scheme where they can almost flip him back. And maybe that's the second, the way he ages, right? Is if he loses a step or loses a bit of juice as a pass rusher, if someone's able to say, hey, remember how you were right at the start when you were a Steeler? Let's go back to that a bit more. Let's try and make you more of a balanced player because you're not able to, generate 65 pressures anymore. You're kind of losing a step. I don't know if we're there yet, but I'm kind of curious how Hargrave ages because he's had an interesting career to me where I think the player that he was in Pittsburgh was very different to the player he's been in Philadelphia and San Francisco.
And credit, I mean, I think Philly saw something in him, right? Pittsburgh's always been more of a, hey, those 3-4 defensive ends are more, they are more run defender types. I know Cam Hayward can get after the quarterback, but that's historically your run stop first type of position. Philly saw something in him and said, hey, we're going to let him get up the field, and turned him into an excellent pass rusher. Just to touch on the O-line again for Minnesota, Ryan Kelly comes in. He's got a better long-term track record. The Will Freeze pick was fascinating. He was PFF's number 2 free agent. So other entities had him high on free agent list. The guy had one starting season, 1.5 starting season. What did I say? Number 2 guard.
Free agent.
No, number 2 guard. Sorry. Guard. Yeah. Free agent guard. Sorry. Started a chunk of 2022, all of 2023, 5 games, looked like he was on his way to a career year. So this is last year, but he was like a fringe starter going into 2024. And then he plays 5 games and gets hurt, and he's going to make $88 million over 5 years. Now, as a part of an offensive line in Minnesota that already, I think, has good tackles, I think Ryan Kelly's a nice addition at center, and Freeze is like, hey, he's making a lot of money, but maybe needs to be the 4th best offensive lineman out of this group on paper. It's not bad, but it's a lot of money to pay. But that's when you have the rookie contract quarterback, you can make those decisions and overpay for the scarcity of starting guards.
Well, this is what getting rid of or allowing to walk a better idea. This is what not retaining Sam Darnold allows you to do, right? This is part of the debate internally is, we don't have that many draft picks. We're one of the lowest teams in the NFL in terms of active draft capital. We've got some money to spend, but if we keep Sam Darnold around, we have to dedicate a much healthier chunk of our money to the quarterback room with JJ McCarthy and then Sam Darnold as well. Once you make the decision, you know what? We're going to give it a go without him. We're going to let him go somewhere else, get paid by the Seahawks. We're going to rely on JJ McCarthy, and then, maybe they'll try and get a veteran in there as well. They were trying to get Daniel Jones, didn't get that done. He was on their practice squad last year. But once you make the call, Darnold can go somewhere else. It kind of frees up a pretty healthy chunk of money to go spending over the next couple of years, not just this year, but when you're signing these free agents and they're, 3-4 year deals, that money is largely accounted for by allowing Sam Darnold to go somewhere else and not having to, rejig the plan to do that. Now, you can still debate whether you've overpaid or whether you've signed the right guys. Will Freeze, I think, is an interesting one. I would like to see the contract structure on that one and see exactly, how that money is allocated, how much of it is real money, how much of it is headline agent figures that we're talking about, yesterday. But yeah, there's definitely the potential is there for Will Freeze to be a very good player for them. We're very low, I think, on sample size of, evidence of him playing at that kind of level. So that's always a bit of a gamble. But, theoretically dipping into the Colts offensive line for Ryan Kelly, who in his past has been a really good center and has dealt with some injuries recently, hasn't played at that level for a little bit. And Will Freeze, who's hasn't necessarily shown that level as much, but has shown it much more recently. The potential is there for those both to be pretty big upgrades, but each one of them carries at least a degree of risk.
Yeah, so overall, I'd say I like what Minnesota's doing. I thought when Kwesi took over as the GM, we were like, man, this is the first quote, real analytical GM. He's not the only one, obviously, but just fascinated to see what his process was going to be. And I think it was a couple of years of getting out from longer term contracts, including Cousins. Let's be honest, they stumbled into the Darnold season, and they're going to benefit probably with a 3rd round comp pick coming out of that. So I like to look at moves in totality, right? You signed Darnold for 1 year, you got 14 wins out of him, you got a 3rd round pick back, and now you get to add all these other free agents. The brutal honesty, though, that I also have to bring to the table is I like all these moves for Minnesota. I also don't know if that means they're better next year. It's tough to win more than 14 games and get past the divisional round or to the divisional round and beyond in the playoffs. That's going to be difficult because even the biggest J.J. McCarthy supporters, it's going to be difficult to replicate what Darnold did on the field this year in J.J. McCarthy's first year as starter. So it's all the right moves, but we might see Minnesota only win 10 games next year, 9 games, 11 games, and it might feel worse, even though I think the roster is probably getting better and better.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say this is a disciplined approach to the future of this team by not kind of getting distracted by what Darnold was able to do last year. Remember, the plan for Darnold was basically a bridge quarterback. Everyone expected him to start maybe a month, and then by week 4, J.J. McCarthy would be the starting quarterback, and that was the team, right? Now, McCarthy gets hurt, and suddenly it's, oh man, the season's gone. Sam Darnold, I guess, will be stuck for the whole year, but basically everyone was writing off the year for Minnesota. Darnold comes out of the gate on fire, and we're like, well, we've seen this before. Let's wait for the wheels to fall off. And they didn't for basically the entire of the season, right? The Vikings kept winning games, kept winning close games. Darnold kept playing at that level, the sort of first 3-game level that we've seen from him a few times in his career. And he sustained it basically right up until the end. And then 2 disastrous games ended their season and lost them the number 1 seed. And then in the playoffs, they lost one and done. They're going home. But overall, the totality of what they got from Darnold relative to expectations was spectacular, right? Number 1, they got 4 times the number of games out of him that they were probably expecting to have. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing, but then it became a good thing because the games that they got out of him were at a significantly higher level for the most part than they would have been expecting as well. So I think it would have been very easy to look at that and say, he was so good. It wasn't the plan, but let's change the plan. Let's go with him again because, let's reward him for what we did. We've seen we can win, blah, blah, blah. And instead whether it's because of those final 2 games that scared the crap out of them, whether it's because the money got too high, or if they simply, remained true to the game plan and the belief in J.J. McCarthy, they allowed him to walk and said, we're going to maintain, we're going to stay the course and go with McCarthy. But because they overachieved relative to expectations this year, it's going to be difficult for McCarthy to replicate that kind of performance because ultimately Darnold played inclusive of everything, including those final 2 games, played at like a Pro Bowl caliber level last season, right? So you're asking immediately McCarthy in year 1 as a starter to play at a Pro Bowl level, which is a pretty tough ask. So I would say the chances overall are the Vikings take a step back relative to last season just because it's so reliant on McCarthy being really good right out of the gate.
Yeah, I mean, what are these discussions are about the process, and it's more about just the Vikings. I like talking about the process of all this stuff, Sam. And I think overall, the Vikings are making the right moves and getting the roster better in a good spot and attacking things the way they should with a rookie contract quarterback, and see how that all plays out. They were in. By the way, do you think they're in on Aaron Rodgers? I don't want to spend too much time. We spent a lot of time on it last night, where I thought I highlighted on last night's day 1 recap that it is actually plausible that you could talk yourself into Aaron Rodgers. You could talk yourself into Aaron Rodgers if you're the Vikings. And I would say more so if you're the Vikings than if you're the Steelers or the Giants, because the point I just made, how are you going to get better than last year? I think Aaron Rodgers probably still has a better chance of being better than J.J. McCarthy next year with all these pieces around him. So I wonder if it's still on the table, and it might still be on the table because the Vikings were in on Daniel Jones, and because they were in on Daniel Jones all the way, probably in the $10 to $14 million range, it makes me think, okay, maybe they're not thinking Rodgers whatsoever because they wanted Jones as, a buffer competition, let KOC work his magic, and if you needed him, great. But it's the Colts who go get Daniel Jones, $14 million for 1 year, kind of a prove it deal. If he gets to start, he's going to come in and compete with Anthony Richardson. And we had gotten, a lot of word that this is what the Colts wanted to do, is bring in that competition for Richardson.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the Colts, it makes sense. They get some competition. They also get, by the way, I think an underrated element of that is, remember, Daniel Jones, his use in the run game has been like a really important part of his career so far. Like it doesn't feel like Daniel Jones should be like a pillar of the run game, but actually that's been his most productive play in the NFL so far. So they get to keep, theoretically working on Anthony Richardson, working on the game plan that has him as a big part of the run game. You don't have to change that. You don't have to junk that if Daniel Jones comes in, right? If you get a different quarterback that's like a pure pocket passer, has no business running the ball, you have to dump half the playbook the second he comes in versus Richardson. You can keep more or less the same stuff with Daniel Jones as to Anthony Richardson. And then from Daniel Jones' point of view, he was basically weighing the Minnesota Vikings offer versus the Indianapolis Colts offer. I don't think it comes down to which one does he think is more likely to give him a legitimate either chance to start, or like which one is more likely to end up his way once, you go through a few games. McCarthy is an unknown quantity. On the other hand, the Vikings seem to really like him, and he was expected to be the starter, whereas the Colts are already, wildly equivocating on Anthony Richardson, and Jones may well start week 1 if he looks dramatically better in training camp. So I think it makes sense for both parties. The Colts get a legitimate threat to Anthony Richardson, threat, mentor, rival, competition. And from Daniel Jones' point of view, this is probably his best chance to legitimately be the starter.
I want to respond to something, so a couple other people in NFL media came up with.
Oh, yeah?
Well, Dano was saying, hey, this is a lot of money for Daniel Jones. I wonder if Anthony Richardson demands a trade. That was the question. Right. And then the second one was Andrew Brandt, talks a lot about the business of football, used to work with the Packers, was in the front office. His point was saying, we're starting to see a mid-level QB market. This is his tweet. I'll read it. Before, it has seemed either a rookie contract or a $50 million deal. Now you have Darnold at $33 million, Fields at 20, Daniel Jones at 14. We'll see what happens with Aaron Rodgers and others. We'll talk about the Dano thing in a second. The Andrew Brandt thing, the part I disagree with is I think the Darnold one is starter money, right? I think Darnold is still low-end starter money. And when you look at it that way, like, I would say kudos to the Seahawks for playing that game, because every other time a quarterback was decent, they had to get 45 or 50 million. And so we've maybe broken that trend. So I'd say Darnold is still starter money at 33, call it low end starter money. That's that mid-tier quarterback contract we've been asking for years. Fields and Jones, I think those are just bridge quarterback deals. Those are adjusted for inflation, Matt Flynn, Mike Glennon. So it's not a reset of the market. Justin Fields, like if the Jets draft a quarterback, Justin Fields might not start. And if Anthony Richardson does improve, Daniel Jones might never see the field. These are bridge quarterback, high-end backup type of contracts adjusted for inflation. And so same thing I would say to Dan O. It's not like big money for Daniel Jones. Anthony Richardson needs to ask out. It's go ahead, compete for the job, man. This dude's making 14. This is what Mike Glennon or Matt Flynn would have made. So
14 is inconsequential money in terms of, like last year, Sam Darnold got $10 million. And remember, adjusted 10% plus for inflation, for salary cap inflation, right? So even just that contract a year from now would be $11 million. Instead, it's 14. But Sam Darnold was seen as he might play 4 games. It was a nothing deal. Like, $10 million. He could start if we need him to, but ultimately this guy's probably going to play 4 games, and then we turn the keys over to JJ McCarthy, and that's fine. $14 million. Yeah, sure. It's like, it's not insignificant. It's not nothing, right? But it is bridge quarterback money / rival competition money. It's not, this guy's definitely starting and there's no way out, around that. Like Richardson has no pathway to being the starter. Even the Fields thing, right? Like people were saying, I can't remember who it was. Somebody was like, it's great to finally see Fields being given a 2-year deal. Actually, I know who it was. It was Chase Daniel. And I remember thinking that you'd think someone that's had that many contracts in the NFL would have a vague idea how the league works. Like, 2 years does not mean anything. That's not like a runway. He's got 2 years to prove he's the starter on that contract. Finally, Justin Fields gets a chance to just have a line of sight through to being the star quarterback that he can be. Like, he might, okay, 2 years, $20 million. He has a shot to start for a period of time, but like equally, they could draft his successor in a month's time, and his contract does not stop that happening, right? So if Shedeur Sanders or whatever slips to the Jets and they love Sanders, they could draft him, and this runway, this multiple year runway that Chase Daniels thinks exists now for Justin Fields might last a month before Shedeur is thrown out there and Justin Fields is the next Mike Glennon. Like, what are we talking about?
I tend to disagree with a lot of Chase Daniels' interpretations of what's happening on the football field and off of it. That's just my.
But that's why I'm shocked. Like, okay, yeah,
I'm not throwing shade. I'm just saying there are some people who have football, and this is why I try not to. I don't watch football media as much as possible. But you're on the social media, so it gets thrown in your face. I don't want to be swayed by anyone. I just tend to disagree with Chase Daniel more than I agree with him.
Agreed. But what I'm shocked by is someone who had like that many contracts is unaware of how, like, this is pretty basic. Like, 2 years, $20 million does not equal 2 years of guaranteed starting in today's NFL, right? If it ever did. I don't understand how somebody that's had a variety of different contracts, including sort of fringe starter contracts, could possibly think that. Like, how do you not know better than that?
I don't know, man. The guy's made a lot of money as a backup.
A lot of money. I mean, he's in the like dollar per snap Hall of Fame, that list that we drew up years ago. Like,
yeah.
How many salary dollars have you made per snap of NFL action? Chase Daniels is like a Hall of Famer, right up there with our former colleague Bruce Gradkowski, who was surprisingly on that list.
Top 10 business Hall of Famer when it comes to the quarterback position. I want to talk a little bit more about Daniel Jones and the situation in Indianapolis. So when Dano was saying, hey, Anthony Richardson should demand a trade, I was thinking of it more from the team angle. Like, if you were the Jets, who still, again, I interpret the Jets Fields deal as, we have no options. We have to reset this entire organization. Justin Fields is a beautiful buy low option. If he has to start for us, great. If we love a guy in the draft, great. Would a team like the Jets, should they try to flip a pick for Anthony Richardson? Or is his stock that low in Indy's building that you could trade a 4 for Anthony Richardson, who, by the way, is still very young, has had good games, and has had awful games? And I know the completion percentage, and I know you could throw whatever Anthony Richardson stats at me that are terrible, and I get it. Like, I had questions about that for him coming out as an inexperienced Florida quarterback. But he also has that running ability that you could build around, that offsets low completion percentages, that raises the floor of the offense if he stays healthy. That's the other issue. So if you're the Jets and you could flip a mid-round pick for Anthony Richardson, would you do that? Or at least call Indy and see, like, how low are you on this guy that you're bringing Daniel Jones in here to compete?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of teams should be at least finding that question, like the answer to that question out, right? How much would this cost? Hey, we're interested. What's the price, right? Like, just simply calling up and finding out the price of the thing you're interested in. But going back to the Richardson perspective for a second, from Dano's point of view, right? Okay, they've just brought in Daniel Jones, giving him $14 million. That's an indication that they've lost faith in Anthony Richardson, so he should get out, right? My question to that would be, how many teams? Yeah. Where do you think, of the other 31 teams, how many of them do you think are interested in Anthony Richardson as a starting quarterback? Like, is the team that he has the best chance of starting for in 2025 and beyond the Indianapolis Colts? Because I think it is. I mean,
that's why I brought up the Jets, because as of a few days ago, maybe it was the Raiders. Well, they have Geno Smith. The Seahawks just signed Sam Darnold. Could it be the Titans? Well, they're in the division and they have their choice of Cam Ward, right? And if they pick Cam Ward, it's Cam Ward. Right. So I think it's the Jets. And you might say the Steelers.
Does he start over Fields?
He competes in the same way he's competing with Daniel Jones. Yeah, right.
Right. So, I mean, it's just same thing, different place.
Yes. No, I agree. I completely agree. Now, you could say, I see the chat talking about the Steelers and everything. I don't see the Steelers, given the rest of their roster construction, saying, oh, yeah, we want to be they're in on Aaron Rodgers right now. They're trying to win and compete in the AFC North. They don't want to be the reclamation project. And the Giants, they can't afford, like, Joe Shane and Brian Daboll can't afford to do that. If Shane and Daboll were in their first year and they had a choice between the number 3 overall pick being Shedeur Sanders or Anthony Richardson, and those were their only 2 choices, and they didn't care about the veteran QB market, I'd say, yeah, maybe go to the Giants. I don't think there's another place besides the Colts. I'm with you. It's like the Colts and the Jets to me, and it's similar ability to compete for the starting spot.
I definitely don't think. I mean, there are places where theoretically there is sort of no starting quarterback, and he might be an answer. I don't think that those obvious teams are actually particularly interested in Anthony Richardson, because for the same reasons the Colts have like decided it's time to bring in legitimate competition. They can't trust him, right? He, number one, as his own team said, he hasn't shown he can make it through 17 games yet. That's a pretty big starting point. Number two, he hasn't shown he can play particularly well in any given season if he is starting 17 games. So a team like the Steelers or whoever, I don't see them jumping into that. So the very best I think he can do is effectively the same dynamic in a different environment with a team that didn't draft him and has no interest in, sticking with their decision, et cetera. I can't see a place that's better for Richardson than the Colts, who still should theoretically, if it's close, lean in the direction of Anthony Richardson, which is not true anywhere else.
I got one more part on the Colts Daniel Jones thing here. Would this be the best supporting cast Daniel Jones played with of his career? And let me just go through it. Now, the Colts, the last couple of years, have had one of the best offensive lines. They just lost 40% of it to the Vikings in free agency. However, they've drafted, they've got guys like Tanner Bortolini ready to step in at center. But Bernard Ryman at left tackle, Quentin Nelson at left guard, Braden Smith at right tackle. Pretty good 3 starters there. So the offensive line should be solid. Alec Pierce as a deep threat, Michael Pittman Jr. as a high-end possession guy, Josh Downs is one of the best slots in the league. They have a question at tight end, but they could draft Tyler Warren and Jonathan Taylor in the backfield. Is this the best supporting cast? Like, just that trio on the offensive line is better than anything Jones has ever had.
Yeah,
from a pass protection standpoint, other than Andrew Thomas, right?
Yeah, and Shane Steichen, I think, is a good offensive coach. Yeah, I think it's the best situation Daniel Jones has been in. So, I mean, they've got that working for them.
Walt, we're here for a long time. We're going to talk about some stuff for an extended period of time. We're hanging out. We're eating egg scrambles for lunch. We're hanging out. Check the mic. Hit the thumbs up. Hit the subscribe. If you're new, we're taking our time here. We're just going through all the big stories.
So there's I was saying there's no producer in this chat right now. It's just me and you with all the power. There is a thing you can do. It shows you the comments, right?
Yeah.
There's a button you can click that is put user in a timeout. I feel like we might reach the point where Walt gets a timeout during this show.
He gets 3 strikes. He's already got 1. All right. So if he speaks up again, Walt, appreciate the algorithm help that you give us, but don't question what we're talking about. All right. We're just having fun here. We're having fun. Day 2 of free agency. I wanted to talk Giants because they made one of the big splashes earlier today with Javon Holland in the secondary. Paulson Adebo, another cornerback that they picked up yesterday. Saw Pete Schrager highlight the youth in the secondary for the Giants, and I think it's a fair point from Pete Schrags. You had Deontay Banks there, former first-round pick. He's had some ups and downs for sure. Adebo's had his ups and downs too. He's coming off a broken femur, but I think he's got great potential. They just paid a lot of money for him. Last year's third rounder, Andrew Phillips does a nice job in the slot. Tyler Nubin was a second-round pick at safety last year, and then they bring in Javon Holland, top safety on the free agent market. And Holland coming off of one of his worst years. But again, I think it's important to look at the totality of a player's career. And Holland's career has been him being a quarter safety, a box safety, a free safety. He covered the slot at Oregon. He can move around and do a whole bunch of different stuff. And I think Holland's had a really nice career across multiple schemes. So they still need a quarterback, so the shiny objects aren't necessarily there, but I think the Giants have done a pretty nice job, reshaping their secondary.
Yeah. I mean, there's some good players in there now. Nubin was part of that secondary or that draft class rather last year where they were basically all good. Tyler Nubin at safety, Andrew Phillips in the slot, like that group was really, all of them were really impressive. What do you make of the Giants? So the last year plus seems to have been like tailor-made to make the Giants look terrible, right? Obviously, you had the whole Saquon Barkley drama, et cetera, et cetera. The other part of this is, so they let Xavier McKinney walk last offseason, and now they are paying Javon Holland more than the contract that they wouldn't give Xavier McKinney a year ago. I mean, it's not necessarily, one follows the other, but it's difficult to look at that and not think that that's a little silly.
I don't know. I mean, I've seen people make that point, and the point for it may have been Pat Leonard, who's Giants beat reporter and everything, and they know Shane pretty well, and he's saying, hey, I don't want to overpay for premium positions. That was the excuse essentially
Right.
of letting McKinney walk. And so I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt there and say, okay, things change and markets change and your scheme changes and things and needs change. I think McKinney was a better fit for the old system, to be honest, when they were playing a lot more single high under Wink, and they're playing more single high in Green Bay. So I think it's a scheme fit thing. And I mentioned with Holland, I think Holland is much more scheme versatile than Xavier McKinney. I think McKinney is one of the best pure free safeties in the NFL. So I don't think it's exactly apples to apples, but I get it. You're trying to find hypocrisy in what they're saying and where they're spending money. And on the surface, it's the same position and, more money for I think they're similar players though, Javon Holland and Xavier McKinney, but McKinney is awesome at what he does, especially in Green Bay right now.
I mean, it at the very minimum, it's pretty inconsistent. Like to say we don't pay for non-premium positions or don't pay premium money for non-premium positions, and then a year later to do exactly that, having let a guy walk for that excuse is at minimum an inconsistent message. And like the coach speak index thing, right? Like the thing that sort of gauges how truthful or otherwise NFL coaches and GMs are. This would be a negative. This would be a hard red, coach speak of when you said that before.
Joe Shane lies, right?
You just didn't want to pay Xavier McKinney.
Sorry, I shouldn't. It's harder to talk over each other when we're not in person. By the way, our studio is being built right now. We'll be in person soon. Joe Shane lies about resource allocation, coach speak index. He's got a 10% truth telling rate or something like that. Can we get a ruling on that for Joe Shane? I was still trying to compliment the moves that they were making, though. At least those moves in the secondary. I think that's better. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think Javon Holland upgrades the team. There's no doubt about that. Like, again, you can question whether that was necessary if they'd kept one of their own players. I think you're right. It's a fair point. They are different players. They're different. They fit different schemes. They fit different positions effectively within the secondary. But yeah, look, I like overall Javon Holland upgrades him. I think Paulson Adebo is a good addition, assuming he comes back healthy from that fairly significant leg break. That's not a trivial one. They re-signed Darius Slayton, who was a guy I think both of us were giving to a lot of teams as that complimentary receiver. I think now that they have Malik Neighbors, they've realized Darius Slayton is actually a very good complimentary receiver. Now they don't need him to be, the number one or something better than that. They've signed some pretty useful players. And of course they brought back Cutlets. So it's been a great offseason.
As long as Cutlets is back, we're good. They still probably have more work to do on the offensive line. I mean, they're essentially reportedly wooing Aaron Rodgers, and we're still looking at this offensive line that has maybe Jermaine Illuminor starting at right tackle over Evan Neal. But if it's Neal coming back and John Michael Schmitz, I mean, I'm always back and forth, right? When you have an offensive lineman in year 3 or 4, that's when I like to buy low on them, but maybe not when they're on my current team. Maybe we'll talk about what the Eagles did in a minute. But if you're the Giants, it's really tough to depend on Evan Neal, to depend on John Michael Schmitz heading into year 3 for JMS and with year 4 for Evan Neal. It's really difficult to do that. And look, I don't want Rodgers, but Rodgers is not at the point in his career where he can have any holes on the offensive line, I don't think. I think he's going to need that pristine up front. So even if they get Aaron Rodgers in the building, I think they have a lot more work to do up front still for the 10th straight year.
Yeah. By the way, fair play to Cutlets. The man's getting $1 million effectively for being a meme. That's good business. Can't knock that.
How do we meme ourselves into becoming millionaires?
Plus, presumably, he's also still doing the sandwich nights, whatever that he was doing, where he was doing signings at the sandwich place, and
making some extra cash on the side.
Yeah.
Maybe we should get. Still, we missed an opportunity every time we ran into Sean Stiletto, his agent, at on the media circuit this offseason, because he would rep me. He wouldn't rep you as an Irishman, but he would rep me, and maybe he would get me the next GM job or whatever it might be.
I mean, it's a lesson, I think, like today's world is, there's that adage that everyone used to get their 15 minutes of fame. Well, now the trick is how much can you monetize the 15 minutes that you get,
Yeah.
right? Number one, you got to get your 15 minutes. You got to be prepared to count, but then you've got to pounce. The second you get your 15 minutes, it's how fast can you spool up every possible avenue of monetization. Look at now, okay, this is not, the story is not ending well at the moment from the looks of it, but the Hawk Tuah girl, right? She went uber viral, like took over the world, and then spooled up like the greatest like commercial enterprise in the world off the back of that. Was like the number 6 podcast on the planet just because of this. Now took a
Made a mistake
misstep,
with the
right?
meme coin. Yeah, misstep with the meme coin. Can't do
Apparently
that.
launched a meme coin, may have been a pump and dump scheme, may have caused a bunch of people to go, broke, and
Got
then
greedy.
went
Got too
dark,
greedy.
right? All allegedly. I don't know anything about it other than the fact that since that point, like let's say that's put a roadblock in the capitalization of the meme. But the point is, the actual initial leap was to massively, like, how much do you think Jeremy Lin made out of Linsanity?
I don't know. He's still going, isn't
Not
he?
enough,
Coaching?
right? Like now, if
Maybe
this
not
happened
enough.
today, I think the world would be better prepared for it.
And we're just the two idiots over here trying to give some really good in-depth football analysis, not trying to go viral with anything crazy, right? Just normal viral, with normal hardcore football analysis. Slow
So,
burn for us
right.
to fame.
Okay, let's get this slightly back on track. Walt would like us to talk about the Kansas City Chiefs handing $30 million to a wildly unproven left tackle whilst shipping off Joe Thuney effectively because it was costing too much money.
It is interesting. I think there's two things at play here. They've come around to the fact that tackle's more important for them than guard. Not even come around to it. The NFL's always believed this, right?
Right.
Now I know the guard money's through the roof over the last few years, and every time that happens, everybody's like, "Oh, of course, people value stopping interior pressure and they value creating interior pressure." But all I know is when Mahomes has a weakness at left tackle, I see him peaking, right? Like Baker when he had a weak left tackle, and I see him peaking, and I think they're trying to avoid that. And they've had this revolving door the last couple of years. And look, I think they didn't have options. Like, what were their options at left tackle? They've tried the developmental left tackle option. They've tried Wanye Morris. I always forget the kid from TCU a few years ago that they drafted 3rd or 4th round, who never is out of the league now, I think. He never made it. They go with Wanye Morris. He's struggled. He's been awful when he's been out there. Kingsley Suamataia was a 2nd rounder. He may have been worse last year. And those guys still have time to come good, right? They could come good, but you have to keep trying. They've had DJ Humphries in. They've had Donovan Smith in. They're on to the next thing, which is Jalen Moore, who's had decent play filling in for Trent Williams. And he's another guy, like when he first had to fill in for Trent Williams, it wasn't great, but he's gotten better and better, and he's got a little over 1,000 snaps in his career. Let me see what the actual offensive total is. 831 snaps in his career. So yeah, he's unproven, was pretty good in pass pro last year, filling in. So that's what they're doing. Like of course it's a risk. Former 5th round pick, it's a risk. But like, what's their other option?
Well, so for example, so what's interesting, number one, that kind of inflation at the guard position arguably started when they gave Joe Thuney his contract. Remember, they signed him as like one of the best paid offensive linemen in the league. Everyone was expecting him to go after a tackle that year because of the way the Super Bowl went. And instead, they started that investment in the offensive line with Joe Thuney. So they kind of started that whole arms race inside, but they've had a weird approach to the offensive line. So obviously Creed Humphrey has just been a great draft pick and, fantastic start to finish, just generally excellent. Trey Smith was kind of a find. They sort of stumbled into him. Like he was a good prospect who had like some weird, like medical red flags that apparently were nothing eventually, but it was a sort of risk. There was a reason he went in the 6th round, and it wasn't anything to do with his play on the field. They took the risk. It's not proved to be a problem. So they've drafted 2 very good players. But the players that they signed in terms of veteran fixes to things, they threw a ton of money at Joe Thuney when that was surprising because people thought they would go after tackles. They then threw a ton of money at Juwan Taylor, who was a career right tackle. They said like day one, we're going to play him at left tackle. Everyone's like, what? That's insane. They gave him $20 million a year when
that
nothing in his
me.
career at that point had said he was worth that. Then very quickly, they were like, actually, you know what? We're going to keep him at right tackle after all. Then they sign Donovan Smith as the stopgap. And since then, they've kind of been trying to piece together that left tackle spot. My point being, they've allocated the money in weird ways to that offensive line other than the guys that they've drafted. And I think this is just a continuation of that. Like because my answer would be, well, why do you, yes, you can argue that's an overpay for a guy like Jalen Moore, who hasn't necessarily shown he's worth that. What is the alternative? Well, my obvious alternative right now would be Cam Robinson. Like, how much more is Cam Robinson than $15 million a year that you're giving to Jalen Moore? Because he's almost certainly clearly that much more of the player at this point in terms of proven commodity. So instead of giving him whatever he would cost, they've gone for a riskier Jalen Moore and hoping he's an answer.
Yeah, and I think the move's interesting. I'm firing up some Jalen Moore tape just live. We'll just talk about it live. Struggled with some power against Jared Verse. Handled Chris Jones a couple times against the Chiefs on some true pass sets. Like, I've got questions about Jalen Moore. I have legit questions. And I think if Kansas City, I think the elite left tackle is completely overrated. I do wonder if it's not for Kansas City. I do wonder if they, maybe not elite, but like Eric Fisher level. They haven't had Eric Fisher level left tackle play in a while. Orlando Brown, I know the chat reminded, hey, they traded for Orlando Brown, which was the first fascinating move, but it was also the first Band-Aid that they put on this since Eric Fisher, because they got him with 1 year left, and then they tagged him, and then they let him walk. Right. And then it's been a revolving door since then. And they Band-Aided with Donovan Smith. And I don't mind the Band-Aid if it's Donovan Smith or Orlando Brown level and they're available. I think since that point, the availability of good Band-Aid left tackles has been rough, man. And I thought the Jawaan Taylor one was probably the most questionable. And look, they've won 2 Super Bowls with Jawaan Taylor as their starting right tackle. Like, how much are you going to question this? But that's always not the best way to judge it too, because like Mahomes and Reed and Spags and Chris Jones, like they're elevating whatever you have. You can get away with mistakes, but I think they're in a tough spot right now to make sure that offensive line is really good going forward. With still a hole at left guard, still Jawaan Taylor at right tackle, and Jalen Moore inexperienced with enough question marks in his game as well at left tackle.
So it's fascinating because on the one hand, you can make that argument that you just made, right? Which is they've won a couple of Super Bowls with this kind of weird offensive line approach that they've taken. I guess you can also make the case that every Super Bowl they've lost has been because of the offensive line. So, you can look at it 2 different ways of being like, yeah, like clearly it's good enough to at least put them in the Super Bowl most years, but it's been the thing that's cost them once they've got to those games where they've been beaten handily. Like the Bucs blew them out. The Eagles blew them out. Like, these are 2 games that they've gotten their ass kicked in because the offensive line fell apart. Now, I think you have to look at that first one and say that wasn't really their offensive line. That was the backup offensive line that they were left with at that point because everyone got hurt. Like, there was one arguable starter, I think, left in that Tampa Bay game. The one this year, I think, was more of a damning indictment because it was legitimately like that was the line. They were the injury at left tackle, et cetera. They were starting left guard at left tackle and were sort of voluntarily weakening 2 different spots, but more or less that was the offensive line and it just got wrecked. So I just find it's an interesting approach to what they're doing. I think the point is reasonable that, is that a lot of money for a guy in Jalen Moore who was wildly unproven, right? 800 and something total snaps. It's draft season now. We are talking about a bunch of guys that are like projects or gambles, or there's, a low sample size because they've got 800 snaps in a college career, right? Well, Jalen Moore's got about that amount of snaps in an NFL career. That's the level of unproven gamble we're talking about. And instead of a first round draft pick, it's $30 million over 2 years. So it is a gamble, but it probably is significantly cheaper than a Cam Robinson contract. Ronnie Stanley was taken off the market. Alaric Jackson was taken off the market. Like, a lot of these other left tackle options were gone at that point. So you had to do something if you wanted.
They're not going to pay $20 million to Dan Moore.
Right. It's better than that. I mean,
Right.
risky as it is, it's a better gamble than handing Dan Moore Jr. $80 million or whatever it was.
Yeah. So the standard's high in Kansas City as well, right? Like we're not talking about, man, the O-line was so bad they won 7 games last year. How did they get back on track? They won the 15 games or whatever it was and go to the Super Bowl. And the goal is, if you're Kansas City, obviously, is how do you win the Super Bowl and put yourself in position to win a Super Bowl every single year. And I do think they're a little, I feel like Mahomes might be a little more susceptible to, say, the O-line being less than stellar, whereas like a Tom Brady might have been more susceptible to when his playmakers weren't up to par. Again, this is a fine line of, you're in the AFC Championship every year. How do you make sure you win the Super Bowl and give yourself the best chance? And so I think the Chiefs, have to make sure that they uncover every rock for their offensive line. And Jalen Moore is kind of a hedge where they could still draft another developmental tackle and throw him into the mix and see what happens in the coming years.
One guy I think that would be interesting as an alternative option. I think Josh Jones is still a free agent, and at left tackle, Josh Jones
He
did he?
signed
Where did he sign?
Seattle. I think Seattle.
Okay, that's because Josh Jones has more snaps at left tackle, like at good left tackle level in his NFL career than Jalen Moore does.
Yeah,
So
he's in Seattle. Sorry to interrupt. 1 year up to $4.75 million in Seattle. Sorry.
Okay, nice. So, but that was an alternative option that could have been, the start of all this. Josh Jones would have been a guy that I'd be interested in at some point.
This
what
is
was I gonna say?
why,
Oh, yeah.
by the way. I mean, we've turned it into a bit of a spoof or whatever with the Morgan Moses thing. Like, imagine if the Chiefs just got Morgan Moses a couple years ago, who I think is better than Jawan Taylor. Right?
Right.
He makes half as much as Jawan Taylor. He's older, but if you had him for 3 years, he doesn't miss time, better in pass protection, better run blocker, and you had him for $10 million a year, then you have the resources to deploy elsewhere on the defensive line, on the offensive line. Or to buy low on Josh Jones that we've been pushing for 3 straight years now, just in case he could figure it out at left tackle.
I remember being at the Combine the year where the Chiefs signed Jawan Taylor, and remember he was an upcoming free agent at that point, and the buzz at the Combine that year was like, "Hey, Jawan Taylor is going to get paid like big money," and we were like, "What? Why? Like, what are you talking about?" You're like, "Oh, the NFL thinks this guy's amazing as a pass blocker," and you're like, I mean, it's hard to find data that backs that up. Like the PFF grades are definitely better as a pass blocker than they are in run blocking, but that's because the run blocking grades are terrible. Like the pass blocking is just better than terrible. It's, above average maybe, but it's not good. It's not elite. But the talk was like, nah, trust me, the NFL loves this guy. He's going to get paid. And then Kansas City comes out with a $20 million a year offer. And even then it was like, whoa. And I think because it was the Chiefs, a lot of people sort of talked their way into being like, well, actually, Jawan Taylor's, he's a good pass protector, like blah, blah. They bought the story, right? But actually, on reflection, if you just rewind to the point before you heard that he was going to get paid, they paid a guy big money who didn't ever deserve it and got the consequences of that. Like they overpaid for a substandard player at right tackle, and that has been a problem since that point.
And he jumps the snap enough to be okay in pass protection. If he didn't have that ability to jump the snap the way he is, man, I don't know. He's right on the borderline, and that's led to a lot of penalties. But, and by the way, this is different. Like we poo-pooed the penalties with Laramie Tunsil, but it's because everything else he does from a pass pro standpoint is elite. Jawan Taylor's penalties, I believe, have been an issue because he's a pretty good pass protector. He's okay. He's not great.
Yeah, and I don't even, I'm fine if you want to dismiss the penalties themselves as an issue, but the point is he's not a good enough pass blocker to offset the negatives, whereas Tunsil absolutely is. Like Tunsil's issue, if you want to call it that, is it's all the ephemeral stuff on the fringes. Like, is he a leader? Is he, is he a negative in the locker room? All that kind of stuff. Like, that's what people talk about and is he, soft effectively is the accusation, right? He's not a good run blocker, not because his technique is weak, just because he doesn't want to do it. He's just, he's a pass blocker. So the other point I was going to make is I do wonder, we tend to think of players as constants. Like, this is what this guy is. This is how he plays. And this is what he will be for the entirety of time. Patrick Mahomes, I wonder if he started to develop some bad habits in terms of how he behaves in the pocket / with his pass protection. He was this guy, like one of the most famous plays he will have in his entire career is that wasp touchdown in the Super Bowl against San Francisco, right? Where he just drops, fires the ball. He's like 11 or 12 yards deep in the pocket by the time that ball leaves his hands, because he knew he had to buy a little bit of time. He knew he couldn't, he knew it was an overload. He didn't, blah, blah. But he has had this tendency to drop beyond the pocket, which when you're talking about any quarterback other than Mahomes is like a cardinal sin. Like
Right.
Peyton Manning would tell you that dude would spend 20 minutes talking about how you can never do that. Never. Because you will ruin the leverage of your offensive line. The pass protection integrity is gone. And suddenly you've caused a problem that didn't need to be there. Now, Mahomes has made a career out of doing that, and he's been incredibly good at it. But I wonder at what point it starts to actually become like a bad habit that you're leaning on a bit too much. And if he pulled himself back in the other direction and was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to make it a concerted effort for a bit to not drop beyond the pocket and like screw my offensive tackles and, cause these problems. I might make their life a bit easier, which might make them play a bit better, which might make my life a bit easier in turn. I do wonder a little bit if he's skewing in that direction in a way that's not helping this whole dynamic.
In addition to just sack rate was up last year, pressure to sack rate was up last year. I think he had fewer of those plays where he was 1 mile an hour faster than people tracking him down. He just had a few more of those plays. And so I'm not saying he's lost a step. He's done forever. Like, he could have a great offseason workout program. He's still in his prime, right? Great offseason workout program, and he's back to it. But I think there's a little bit of that to Mahomes' game where maybe he needs more help up front than maybe he's needed in the past. I want to talk. Do you want to talk Texans for a little bit? So they made a trade today, and I thought it was interesting on both ends. Obviously, what they did with Laramie Tunsil, you already have offensive line issues. You opt out of Laramie Tunsil. Talked about that a bunch last night. They traded former first-round pick Kenyon Green to the Philadelphia Eagles. They get Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, CJ Gardner-Johnson, back, which I kind of like that move, and maybe for both teams. I don't know what CJ Gardner-Johnson's fit was going to be in Philadelphia going forward. I love Philly from a buy low offensive line perspective. I talk about this all the time, like buying low on offensive linemen in year 3, 4, 5. All for it. Do that all the time. But it's harder if you're Houston, once again, to just like trot Kenyon Green out there. He was not going to start for the Texans. You can't trot him out there again and say, well, we hope he develops, because that's what offensive linemen do. So they probably had to move on. But for Philly, not bad as a buy low. And I like the move for Houston, bringing in, just another versatile piece to the secondary. But Houston's offensive line is just a big question mark right now. And I don't think it's like far away either. If you look at available free agents and Mekhi Becton and Kevin Zeitler and Tevin Jenkins, like I think they're a couple mid-tier guard contracts away from looking much better on the offensive line. I think they could do that. And then maybe Titus Howard is playing left tackle, or maybe you're trading up, like Lance Zierlein, who's plugged in Houston before this trade, had them trading up for Kelvin Banks in the first round. And now they have the extra draft ammo. So I think there's a path. Like, there's a lot of what ifs here. But if the Texans have 2 mid-tier guard contracts and a trade up for Kelvin Banks, all of a sudden this offensive line's reshaped and not looking bad. But right now it is a lot of question marks. They don't have anybody in the building right now that are with starting experience.
Yeah. I mean, so that was the weird thing about the offensive line last year is okay, they ran through a whole bunch of combinations. Like, guys were getting hurt left, right, and center, which didn't make it any easier. But you looked at the personnel, it's like this line should not be as bad as it is right now. Like, Laramie Tunsil is an elite level pass protector. He's okay as a run blocker. He's good. He's not a weakness, even with the penalties. You've got Titus Howard, who's shown capable play before. Shaq Mason was previously one of the better right guards in the NFL. And then you've got these young guys at center that have shown bits and pieces. Like, this line shouldn't be one of the worst in the league, and yet it consistently was. Obviously, chopping and changing the starting 5 was a big part of that. But I think because of that, you're like, well, it's kind of, remember when the Colts a few years ago, their offensive line just fell apart? You're like, it's almost the same personnel as like the best line in the NFL a couple of years ago. Why is this line suddenly awful? Like, it shouldn't be as bad as it is. So I think there's definitely a world where this offensive line in Houston gets put back quickly, and it's not it's not a mess going forward, even without Laramie Tunsil. I think trading away Tunsil definitely makes them worse. But let's try this. I was speaking to a former NFL player who's plugged in around the Houston market, and he was sort of saying, look, the thing about Tunsil is like it's a lot of small things that has basically eroded all goodwill towards him in Houston. Like he described him as the least blue collar offensive lineman he's ever seen. It's just a ton of like drive killing negatives, the big plays, the time they're all timed for the worst time. When he has false start penalties, he blames the center, even though nobody else has those problems. It's all these kinds of things, right? So it's a sort of feeling that he's this negative influence within the building, and that's why they're willing to downgrade, like clearly, unequivocally downgrade at left tackle, regardless of who comes in there almost, because they think that you get the draft picks, we rebuild, we'll be better in the future. So they're moving on from him. The Kenyon Green thing, I mean, he was just a bad pick. Like right now, he's a bust. So we're moving on from him. We'll get Gardner-Johnson back as a good addition there. But I do think that like there's 2 or 3 players that are fixes to that offensive line already on the roster. So a Calvin Banks or, 1 or 2 additions in free agency, I think you could make this group reasonable again next year really quickly.
They have Laken Tomlinson in there. He's a couple years removed from his best play, but again, like buy low, see what sticks types of options. Those aren't great feeling, but like I said, I think there's still a couple guards or a guard or 2 that you can get back in there. I don't know what they do at tackle though. Probably have to go somewhere in the draft. It's interesting to me that they're doing the opposite on the defensive line, because you were talking last night about all the peripheral moves that Nick Caserio's making. They bring back Mario Edwards Jr., Derek Barnett. So now you've got Will Anderson, Daniil Hunter, Derek Barnett, Danico Autry, Mario Edwards Jr., Sheldon Rankins back in town, Tim Settle. I mean, I'm not saying all those guys are great, but at the top, it's great. Will Anderson and Daniil Hunter, and the rest of those guys are very good rotational players. It's like they're rolling 7 deep on the defensive line right now and 2 deep on the offensive line. So it's just an interesting spot where Houston is, and clearly have some catching up to do on the offensive line in the next few weeks here.
Yeah. I think bringing in Gardner-Johnson is a good addition for them on the defensive backfield. I think that's a nice move. The Kenyon Green thing is interesting only because Jeff Stoutland is there in Philadelphia. Like,
yes.
Kenyon Green was a first-round draft pick who was overdrafted at the time. Like, I don't think he should have been picked at 15 overall in that draft. That felt like a reach at the time. He has been, you never like to be too over the top in negativity and criticism, but he's been garbage as a starting NFL offensive lineman, right? In 2 years, he's got PFF pass blocking grades of 27 and then 39.7. He's given up 9 sacks in 875 pass blocking snaps. He's given up 75 pressures in that amount of time and 19 penalties. He has been terrible, and that's why he was no longer starting for this team. However, Jeff Stoutland is arguably the best offensive line coach in football, who has turned Jordan Mailata from a rugby player into a starting and one of arguably the best left tackle in the NFL right now, factoring in age, etc. He's turned him into that in like a space of a couple of years. He rescued the career of Mekhi Becton as a former first round, guy that had busted effectively, now for different reasons, injuries more than disastrous play. But anyway, resuscitated his career, turned him into a good guard last year. He's the only reason I'm remotely interested in, what can Kenyon Green be, because he's got a track record of fixing people. Now, it's not everything, right? They drafted Andre Dillard in the first round, and he's bad. And he got replaced by Jordan Mailata, the guy that they discovered. So it's not a guarantee, but it at least makes it interesting.
Yeah, that's good. It's a good breakdown there, right? I mean, like the buy low opportunity when you have, it mentioned Minnesota's schematic advantage. That's part of Philly's advantage, right? If you have an offensive line coach that can get the most out of offensive linemen, and you could steal starters like Mailata, like Becton from places when, they weren't great before, that's huge. I think that's great. I was going to follow up on something. I can't remember what it was. Something in the chat. We had some questions about the Saints and the Dolphins. We'll answer some questions. We're just hanging out here. Any breaking news recently here? Not much. It's all stopped now that we went live.
Of course, yeah. The Panthers released Miles Sanders, so pour one out for Miles.
Just opening the door for Ashton Genty at 8 overall, as we've been predicting for the Panthers. What can we say about the Saints? I also saw hashtag cap is fake, Mike Hess, and the Saints are a good example of the cap not being fake because they have zero flexibility to do anything from a roster building perspective, and they're back with Derek Carr as their starting quarterback because they don't have any cap flexibility. Reminder that cap compliance is not the same as cap flexibility. Everybody can get under the cap, but not everybody can manipulate it to the point where you can maximize your roster. So there are limitations when it comes to the salary cap.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way of explaining the salary cap is that it very, very rarely prevents you from making any single move. You can almost always free up the kind of cap space to make any one individual move, but you can't do 7 of those, right, consecutively.
Right.
Like ultimately the cap is a restrictor. It is a roadblock in terms of what you want to do. You don't have endless freedom, but it's unlikely to be the reason that you can't make a single individual move at any given moment.
Some questions about the Dolphins. Somebody asked about the Dolphins. I thought some of the teams that have been somewhat quiet. Let me check Miami again. Remind myself of what they've brought in. I like the Zach Wilson move. I really do. He's my new John Ross and Will Fuller and Morgan Moses and just, never know. Bring him in every year. Never know when you could stumble into it. James Daniels, nice move.
Yeah, that was a sneaky one.
That dude's hit free agency twice now, like in his mid-20s. So still young, 3 years, $24 million, battled injuries. The upside is there for as much of a guard can have upside. And Fatu Melifonwu coming in at safety, coming off a nice year with the Lions, super athletic because he's a Melifonwu and just $4 million. So Miami needs to make those types of moves. I don't think they're in a spot to make massive splash moves. And I think it's a huge draft for them to start getting younger and to reset that roster a little bit.
I'm going to start trying to pin up questions as they come in so we can reply to them.
So Chase Young and the Saints. I mean, it's
remember we discussed this yesterday. We gotta articulate it for anyone that might be listening because we don't know where this is going to be.
Ask the question. Go ahead.
Vincent Beverly in the chat says, you're making me say this. Do y'all think Chase Young was an overpay?
Do y'all think Chase Young was an overpay?
I don't do well with the word y'all. It's not in my vernacular. I didn't grow up that way. In Ireland, we don't say that. So it just sounds wrong coming out of my mouth.
I don't either. I mean, it's regional in the United States. It's not, I wasn't saying that in Boston either. A little bit, I think, I was a big Chase Young believer over the last couple of years that he could get back to the potential that he showed as a rookie. He was very good as a rookie. He never really got back to that, battled so many injuries. He's been healthier the last couple of years, but I don't think he's been great. He's been pretty good. I don't hate it relative to the market, but I probably would have liked it more a couple of years ago and would have been maybe wrong about it and saying invest in Chase Young for a couple of years.
Yeah, so I think what's happened is something that I just didn't expect to materialize from Chase Young's career. I kind of expected him either to bounce all the way back and look really, really good, or for like injuries to basically ruin him and for him to not be a solid player anymore. And what's actually happened is he's kind of landed in the middle where he's got back. He's been healthy for a couple of years and he's just been pretty good. Like he hasn't gotten back to being anything like elite. He's not been a complete difference maker. He's just settled in as like a solid middle of the road, capable, dependable, reliable starting defensive end. And it's like, in those terms, actually, I think it is reasonable money. It's just, we still, I think, live in this world, both of us, where we're like, this is what he could be. It's like, do you see that? You remember the movie, The Replacements?
Yeah.
The late Gene Hackman, rest in peace. He had I saw this short the other day. It was like, this is one of the greatest lines ever. He's talking to what's the guy's name? Keanu Reeves, whatever his character's name in that thing is. He's talking to Keanu and he's like, in you, I see two people, right? The man you are and the man you should be. And one day those two are going to meet, right? That's kind of where we are with Chase Young. There's like the guy that he is right now, which is a pretty good football player. But then there's the guy over here, which is who he should be. Like this guy who, as a prospect, was better than Nick Bosa, than Joey Bosa, like was basically as good as we'd seen as a college career prospect. And it's like, because of injuries, he's not become that guy yet. Now, will they ever meet? Will those two guys meet? I don't know, but I think certainly I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel like we live in this world where we could see this guy over here and it colors everything we think about Chase Young, as opposed to just being like, Chase Young right now is a pretty good, effective starting edge rusher.
The way I would put it too is like Dayo Odeyingbo made similar money, but coming from the other place, like injury riddled, and I didn't love him coming out, but he was a second round pick and he's been okay. And he ends up probably a similar caliber player. I don't think he's maybe even as good as Chase Young even now. Similar money, but coming from different spots, at least in a starting point in my brain.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Shane Falco, by the way, is the name of his character in that movie.
Falco, yeah. I got to answer this question. Maybe you can help answer it too before we get to where Joe Milton's staying in New England, I believe. He's not going anywhere.
Way to shoot that rumor down.
I'm just saying. Somebody asked what we say instead of y'all. Brett Jones, what do you say instead of y'all? You say you. So you Y-O-U, can be you, the individual, or you, the collective. It can be plural, right? So I believe it's just this. It's to say you all, and even to turn it into the contraction y'all. That is redundant because in the English language, you can be both singular and plural. So it's just a human nervous twitch to feel like you have to distinguish between you, the individual, and you, the plural, when you means both. So it's just bad English is what it is.
So
you is not singular. You can be both. You don't have to say, hey, use guys. You can say use guys. I mean, my family, hey, use guys. My mom would say, y'all, use.
Yeah. So use, that's interesting because this is an Irish thing, right? Use, you down in Southie, you guys with the Boston Irish will still use. Dublin, there's regions of Dublin will use, like Conor McGregor uses the term use, right? More country in Ireland, you'll get ye, like Y-E, like ye,
like Old English.
Yeah, well, no, not it's like a different.
But anyway, sounds like Queen's. Isn't that Queen's English types? Is that Shakespearean?
When my wife is talking to her family, who are all from the country, they will use ye. I am like you. I simply use the English, the plural of you, as I don't understand the need for the other ones.
You.
Anyway.
Use guys.
Use guys.
What did my parents say? They said like the both of them. Like that's not English, Mom, but just calling out my mom here on the show. What else we get? 2 Utes. I say Utes for you. Yeah. The 2 Utes. Oh, we need the soundboard where we could just break out. All right, I got no more use for this guy, the whole thing. Yeah, we're hanging out. Of course it's meaningless talk here, Walt. We're hanging out for multiple hours here, eating some cold eggs.
Be so mad at this.
Good news, though. I've got caffeinated coffee here today. We caffeinated up. Yeah. We've got the real caffeine here on today's show.
Perfect.
Sam, I always find it interesting when teams come out of free agency like the Bears, and you say they just attacked several resources into their offensive line, and a team like Houston goes the other way. And remember last year, last year at this time, it was Baltimore who went into the draft. We're like, what are they going to do? Why would they go into the draft with needs on the offensive line, and particularly at right tackle? And they draft Roger Rosengarten in the second round, and they ease him into the lineup, and he's fine. And again, Baltimore's got this cheat code with Lamar where he makes offensive lines look better because of his run threat and pass threat. But sometimes that happens, right? And you can go into the draft with needs and fill them. The Bucs, the year that they won the Super Bowl, had a massive need at right tackle, wanted to trade up for Tristan Wirfs. They got Wirfs. Had a need at safety. They got Antoine Winfield. Boom, they hit both of their massive needs with great players, and they won a Super Bowl. So it is doable. But coming out of free agency, it's just always interesting when some teams are going all in and some teams are tearing it down, and it's uncomfortable for a while until you know what the answer is going to be there.
Well, look, it's not that you can't go into a draft with a glaring need that needs to be filled. It's that if you do that, the player that you pick has to be good. Like, you simply remove all margin for error when you're doing stuff like that. Now, you can argue that's the case with like any personnel move you make. If you go and sign a free agent right now, the chances are that guy's starting for you. And if he's not good, it's, you've screwed up. So I guess you can make the case that is true for basically any personnel move you make. But it's a bigger risk in the draft where the strike rate is lower. free agents, theoretically, you've gotten proven NFL tape, you know what you're dealing with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can do that. I just think that it's best practice, if you like, to not do that, right? So this idea of, Jerry Jones thinking free agency is not where you fill holes. I actually think that's exactly what it is. Like, free agency is where you should be able to grab players like the Lions, right? The Lions theoretically had two guys starting at corner who they've drafted in the last, the first couple of rounds in the last draft. On paper, you can make a case that those guys should be expected to step in year two and be fine, right? The Lions looked at that and said, that's more risk than we are comfortable with. So let's go and get a veteran, plug him into one of those spots. And now we don't have to do something crazy to mitigate that risk. I would argue that's what free agency is for, is to look at the glaring holes on a roster, right? Like, you can look at these depth charts and basically grade out, right? Where are the starters that are grayed out? The guys we don't have a good answer for right now. Starters that left, starters that we're not comfortable with, whatever it is, right? The sort of question mark over 3, 4, 5, however many it is out of 22 starting spots, right? I would use free agency to get a name in each one of those grayed out, red, question marked roster positions so that I'm comfortable with, if worst case scenario, if I had a game tomorrow, would I be okay with the guy whose name is there playing in this football game, right? That's what I would want to do in free agency. So that when I get to the draft, when my pick gets up, I don't have to grab like the Patriots, right? We're saying they might have to take Will Campbell at 4 overall because their left tackle situation is what it is, right? That's what I don't want to be. That's what I want to avoid. If I think that Will Campbell's the best player available or is the guy I want anyway, that's fine. But I just want to be in a position where I don't have to make those picks if I think the opposite is true, where I'm like, I think this guy's the 15th best player available, but I don't think I'll get him my next pick and I need him. So I have to take him now. And he has to be good. Otherwise, I'm screwed. That's what I think the problem is. So it's not that it's like a terrible thing to go into a draft with a glaring need you need to fill, but it does mean that you're now at the mercy of the draft as opposed to the other way around.
The one other thing I'll add, though, is sometimes you have cut day, and there are other times you can acquire players. The famous to me, James Bradbury getting released after the draft and the Eagles picking him up. It's you don't always know what's going to be available there. Teams aren't always getting rid of good players at that time, so it's risky. But I'm saying there are other times besides the draft,
and you have to be there. Then you have to be sort of like, you have to hope that the players that are released also correspond with needs that you have. You know what I mean? Like it's definitely, again, opportunistic. Like if you can pick up one of those guys, great. But I don't know that you want to be relying on that as like, I swung and missed in free agency. I swung and missed in the draft. So now I'm just sitting here waiting for Darius Slay to get released. Like that's probably not sound process either.
We do have breaking news that could be a domino to fall here. San Francisco 49ers releasing Leonard Floyd, starting edge rusher. He's coming off a year, the lowest PFF grade of his career at 53.4, lowest pass rushing grade of his career at 53.9. But he did have 8.5 sacks. He's always been one of those guys that finishes well. 10 sack guy 3 different times in his NFL career, I believe, including the playoffs. So he's always had a lot of, one of those guys that has a lot of sacks. Not really a dominant pass rusher, never been a dominant pass rusher, but a good, dependable player. This potentially opens the door for Joey Bosa to sign with the 49ers and reunite with his brother Nick. Niners are an interesting team this offseason because they're losing a lot of players. They're losing a lot of the nucleus that got them to the Super Bowl in 2022. And so Floyd is out as the Niners continue to purge the veterans off the roster right now.
Yeah, I think Floyd's an interesting pickup now for a team that already has an established star somewhere. What I think we saw last year was what happens when he's generally led a pretty charmed existence in terms of lines he's been on. Like he's usually had a much better player somewhere that he's been able to work in tandem with and kind of exploit to some big numbers. Last year, remember, Hargrave was injured, Nick Bosa then was injured. All of a sudden, Leonard Floyd is your number one pass rusher, and he's got to lead the line. I think we saw he's just not capable of doing that. Like he's not that good. He's capable, but he needs to be a sidekick, right? He can't be Batman. So I think if you have Batman already, if you've got a guy on the defensive line that's an absolute baller, Leonard Floyd is a very good complementary piece to add. You just can't have him as your primary pass rusher.
I don't even want him as a starter, though. I mean, one of my concerns with San Francisco, and this, I wasn't like predicting a 6-win season for them or anything last year, but my concern with San Francisco was they go to the Super Bowl in 2023. I say 22 by accident. They go to the Super Bowl in 2023 in a year where they brought in Chase Young and Randy Gregory. They already had Nick Bosa. They had Javon Hargrave. They had Eric Armstead. And you're like, put up any teams. This was, talk about the Eagles blueprints. The Niners did this. They went to the Super Bowl with their 6 to 8 defensive linemen. Good luck. Try blocking all these guys. Javon Kinlaw was there. Go back and look at that 2023 49ers defensive line. Those dudes are all making bank today, this week, right? They were all there. And last year they didn't have it. Leonard Floyd was their starting edge opposite Nick Bosa. Just was not good enough. He's a 3 or a 4 to me at this point in his career. So, a team with a deep defensive line, I think you're right. Complimentary piece, good finisher, cleanup type of guy. That's always really been Leonard Floyd's career. I am interested in the buy low on Joey Bosa. I don't know how much he has left in his career, to be honest. The injuries have just been so prevalent for Joey Bosa. It does make sense for him to want to play with his brother, but Nick's obviously in a much better spot in his career than Joey is at this point.
Yeah, Joey Bosa is a guy. I mean, I don't want to say I feel sorry for him because it's not like he's had a bad, he's doing pretty well for himself, Joey Bosa. But I do feel like, again, the player that he could or should have been versus the player that he has been because of all those injuries is a wild disparity. Like those injuries have just torpedoed what was a really, really good career to begin with. And that is kind of sad, kind of unfortunate.
We want to talk Niners for a minute here. Travarius Ward out, Talanoa Hufanga out at safety, Dre Greenlaw out at linebacker. I mean, those were two of my favorite moves. The two guys that went to Denver, Hufanga and Travarius Ward. Leonard Floyd out, Jalen Moore at left tackle as the rotational guy. They traded Deebo Samuel. I mean, it is a legitimate reset. They released Kyle Juszczyk. That's a big deal for them. Not many full teams that use a fullback around the league, and they used him well. So kind of an end of an era for the 49ers. And that doesn't mean everything's done. It just means they can't be as top heavy anymore with where they're spending their money. Javon Hargrave out as well. They spent a ton of money on all these players. It's now time to pay Brock Purdy and time to get back to drafting. I think last year they drafted well. I saw the point made, like every one of these players that left, they drafted a player at that position. Renardo Green at corner and Ricky Pearsall at receiver, at guard with Dominic Pooney. I think they drafted well last year, but we've highlighted a few. The drafts before that, 2021, 22, 23, not as good, and in a spot where you could use that youth movement stepping in right now as those veterans move on.
Yeah, I mean, they need last year's draft class to continue to look good. I mean, Pearsall, I think, was still very much an open question, and not necessarily for his own fault. I mean, the guy got shot. So him showing anything year one is,
right,
reasonably impressive. Renardo Green looked very good at corner. Dominic Pooney looked excellent at guard, but like that trio in particular really needs to kick on in year two and become like important parts of this team because they are now needed. I mean, my question would be, how much trouble do you think the 49ers are in? Because you trade away Deebo. He's been a significant part of this team. You still have George Kittle. He's arguably the best tight end in the game. Brandon Ayuk is there. He's coming off a knee injury. That we don't know. Let's assume he's back healthy. That's important. Trent Williams is arguably their best player, but he's now like 37 and is starting to miss. He's starting to hit that Tyron Smith run where it's like you kind of have to factor in Trent Williams missing time during the season now. It's not a guarantee that you're going to get him. Juwan Jennings played really well, being sort of elevated up the depth chart and being asked to take on bigger roles. So skill position-wise, I think they're still in a reasonable position. Offensive line is a concern. And now, like, all these moves are sort of seen through the lens of it's all making space for this Brock Purdy contract, right? They've led this blessed existence of literally having the best value contract in football, right? Brock Purdy being selected with the last pick of the draft is literally the best value contract in the NFL. It's a better value deal than if he'd been a priority free agent. They would have been paying him more money, right? So the fact that Purdy has been good on the cheapest possible NFL contract has been the best value it can possibly be. You're about to replace that with one of the most expensive quarterback contracts in the NFL. So you're going from two complete opposite ends of the spectrum. And that's why you have to start making some of these moves and shedding contracts.
So I think everything you laid out there, I think the offense will still be okay. I mean, they're picking at 11. We've linked them to guys like Kelvin Banks quite a bit. Banks, who maybe comes in at left guard and moves to left tackle to replace Trent Williams. If they do that, I think the O-line's in good enough shape. The 1-2 punch at receiver of Brandon Ayuk and Jawan Jennings is really good. We forgot how good Jennings was. And then Pearsall in there as a speed threat. Kittle, who you mentioned. I think they're okay. I think the health of Christian McCaffrey would help quite a bit if they have him. And I'll say this about Brock Purdy. I thought he had turned a corner even more last year. That tapered off a little bit. I still think Brock Purdy's good. I think he's still better than what they had in Jimmy Garoppolo. So statistically elevated a little bit by all these studs and having Kyle Shanahan. But we know what he can be with Shanahan's offense, and I think he brings enough within scheme, outside of scheme ability, that you can win with Brock Purdy, even with the price. So I think the offense is going to be fine. Defensively, that's where I have the concern. Everything I laid out about when the Niners defense was getting after it and they were 7 and 8 deep on the defensive line. You look at their depth chart right now, Sam, it looks like what we were criticizing the Arizona Cardinals for, plus Nick Bosa, right? So they have Nick Bosa, and then it's the Cardinals. Defensive fronts, which we thought was absolutely terrible last year. And so defensive ends of Drake Jackson, your Turgros Matos. I mean, these are guys that are 3, 4s, and 5s on your edge rotation. Jordan Elliott, Kalia Davis, Evan Anderson. Anderson could be a pretty good run stopper. Fine. They need a lot of bodies on the defensive line. So it's a high volume draft for San Francisco. I think if we're talking about them competing for this year, I think it's one of the most important drafts for a team in the NFL. I don't think every draft is important for this year, for every team every year. I always say you draft for 4 years, not for one. But if the Niners want to make a move in the NFC West in this youth movement, I think they have to hit on 3 or 4 draft picks immediately. And I think last year was in the right direction. Those first 3 picks all look pretty good. Maybe Mustafa as well. They've got some players that could step in and play. I think they have to hit on some picks this year, though.
Yeah, they do. I mean, the only way out of a run of bad drafting really is a run of good drafting. And they look like they did that last year. They need to start doing it for multiple years in a row. I want to play a game and read you. It's the caption as opposed to it's the caption to a little TV segment, but it's from the guy who's in the segment. So I'm assuming the caption is fair as opposed to manipulated. From Mike Garafolo.
I hate this game already, but let's go.
From the television. From Free Agent Frenzy. The hashtag Giants have had good conversations with Aaron Rodgers and have let him know they believe he and wide receiver Malik Nabers would vibe well. Your thoughts?
I tuned in. I said I don't listen to NFL media, but I snuck in there a little bit yesterday. I watched the insiders a little bit.
Because Twitter was down. You had to get news from the TV like a caveman.
Caveman style, was watching TV for my news, and listened a little bit to this when it got brought up, and they're trying to convince him that he vibes well. I think they mean on the field, right? Oh, he's fast. He's good after the catch. He catches slants.
He's really in the darkness retreats in ayahuasca as well. You guys get on well.
Yeah, I assume they're not talking about his off the field drug use or whatever. They're more talking about, hey man, you like to run slant flat. This guy could run some slants and run after the catch.
We can't get Malik away from books on the Tartarians. You guys would get on really well. Trust me.
I assume those are the vibes. Man, can we have Hard Knocks in the Giants building this year? I need to see Joe Shane on the phone with Aaron talking about Malik Nabers' vibes and how this is the way to go. We're the team for you. Forget Tomlin and the Steelers.
We should be it should be a deal, right? Joe Shane can keep his job, but only if you do Hard Knocks every year.
If you do Hard Knocks. I mean, I think they need a year to come good, right? Don't they need a year to kind of balance out what happened last year? Let's have a redemption story. Hard Knocks redemption. I think that's what they need. So, what are your thoughts on the vibes?
I just find the whole concept kind of funny. Yeah, you and Malik would get on really well. You guys would vibe. I don't think you really need to sell that. It's like he looks like an elite wide receiver, an elite number one wide receiver. If you believe you're still a good quarterback, why wouldn't you vibe?
Vibe with everybody. I'll tell you what wouldn't vibe, I don't think, is the offensive line with the Giants.
Again,
Like I think the Steelers' offensive line is at least young and on the way up overall. I don't know if the Giants have that for Aaron Rodgers. I mean, if I was Rodgers, I'd go to Minnesota if they would have me.
well, yeah, again, like you're looking around, you're like, Rodgers is now, whatever you think about how well he can just throw the football on a given moment, he's definitely reached the point in his career where he needs more offensive line help than previously. Like this is there. I think most quarterbacks, this starts to happen to them at some point where even if they can still play, they need the line more than they used to. This happened. This was maybe the only way that Brady, his age, manifested at any point, right? Was towards the end, he needed the line a little bit more, I think, than he used to in New England, right? And this, like Phillip Rivers, this happened to back with the Colts, at the end of the Chargers time. Like even the guys who don't lose it in terms of arm velocity or even athleticism, like they just reach a point where suddenly they require protection a bit more than they used to. Rodgers has definitely reached that point where he needs a decent line in front of him. I don't see that the Giants can get to that by the start of this season, right? Now, it's still early. There's still names out there, as you said, that can start, 2 or 3 signings, a draft pick here, maybe. But, they might still need 4 starters, like 4 different new starters, maybe 3, but at least 60% of that offensive line still needs to be changed. So that's a big ask.
And we said we always talk about creep back toward average and spend 10 million on guards and bring them in. And they theoretically did that last year with John Runyon and Illuminor. I just don't know if it was the right players or enough of the right players.
I think Illuminor, like, that's what I'm saying.
Illuminor is fine, but like I don't think Runyon's very good.
No, that's why I'm saying 3 or 4, right? I think Illuminor can theoretically start and be okay as one of those spots. Now, I don't see there might not be evidence that they're putting him in the right position, which isn't helpful, but I think he could be a perfectly serviceable starter if the rest of the line is good. But you might still need to upgrade the entire interior of that line. And number one, I don't know that they're inclined to do that because they already signed guys like John Runyon. But number two, I'm just not sure they can do it by then. So if you're Rodgers, like, hey, look, we've got Malik Neighbors out here. That's the good news. The bad news is you're running for your life every play.
Let me read something to you from Chris Sims and get your reaction to that while we're playing that game. Cool. 2 things stand out. This was earlier today. 2 things stand out right now. 1, marquee names involved in trades show how mediocre this free agency class is. And 2, teams moving quickly on free agent quarterbacks lets you know that teams don't think much of this QB draft class. So free agent class is bad. That's why there's trades. And QB draft class is bad. That's why there's QB signings.
So I'm kind of on board with the first part. Not necessarily that it's bad, but that it's all reflective of what we've talked about before, which is I think the league has gotten better at managing their rosters. The elite players tend not to hit free agency. Teams are good at signing their own players now. They've understood that that's cheaper, right? It's cheaper to retain your own guy who's good than to let him walk and go looking for a replacement on the open market. That ends up costing you more money long term. So you're just not seeing the high-end impact elite players hit the open market. Everyone that hits the open market is either got some question marks, they're too old, they had too bloated a contract, like whatever. There's a reason that they're hitting the market. So if you want one of those players, the way of getting them is via trade. So I don't think it necessarily is like an indication that this particular free agent class overall stinks. It's just that this is now the way the league is going because of how teams are approaching their roster construction. As for the quarterback thing, I don't think it necessarily, quarterback is the marquee thing, right? It's like, it's the first priority. It's the paramount thing for everybody. If you don't have a quarterback, you need a quarterback. And 2 teams are in position to get one of those right now, theoretically. Maybe only one if you view this as a Cam Ward draft, not a Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders draft. So I think it's entirely plausible that, number one, this happens first, right? Kirk Cousins was the first domino to fall last year at the quarterback position because he was the clear prize in the veteran market. And then we can get to who's jockeying for position in the draft, blah, blah, blah. So I don't really buy that. I think it's just quarterback is the most important position. There are veteran quarterbacks available. So, of course, it's something of a frenzy and it's the first offseason priority for anybody. I don't think it necessarily means that means this draft stinks for quarterbacks.
Yeah, I agree with you and disagree with Sims on that, which is, like last year at this time, the Patriots signed Jacoby Brissett and the Vikings signed Sam Darnold, and that certainly wasn't going to preclude them from drafting a QB. And I famously said, now that Kirk Cousins is in Atlanta, that's great for Atlanta. They don't have to worry about drafting a QB at 8, and they go draft a QB at 8.
But I do think it means, I mean, not necessarily 1-to-1, but I do think like this does appear. It's not like last year's draft class where people expected 4 quarterbacks to go in the top 10. 6 ended up going in the top 11, 12, whatever, 12. So like half of the top 12 picks were quarterbacks. This is not that draft class. Like people are expecting a quarterback to go in the top 3. Maybe we'll get 2 in the top 3, probably get 2 in the top 7 picks. And then we might not get another first round quarterback, or if there is, it'll be like a third sneaks in somewhere. So maximum, we're expecting half the volume of the first round quarterbacks that we got a year ago. I mean, I think that's real, but I don't think that's what's like prompting the suddenness or the eagerness with which teams are pursuing veteran options.
Yeah, and especially like I said about Justin Fields and the Jets, it's a high-end bridge quarterback, not keeping you from drafting a guy. I mean, there's probably a kernel of truth in that. Like if the Jets don't love Shedeur Sanders, and they have a chance to pick him at 7, that's one team that maybe doesn't love Shedeur Sanders and won't pick him at 7, but they'll take somebody later. But I don't know.
But it's also like the teams that need the quarterbacks this year generally are not picking in the first 2 picks, which I think is part of the issue, right? So like if, teams without a quarterback right now, Pittsburgh, the Giants, like if teams like that were picking 1 or 2, I don't think you would necessarily see this like weird, oh, how do we get the quarterback? Like they would those are 2 teams that are going to grab quarterbacks in a month's time.
So we do have some news that's come through here. Former first-round pick has signed with the Cleveland Browns. Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, former Buck, edge rusher, heading into year 5 of his career. They didn't pick up his 5th-year option. He signs for a 1-year, $4.75 million deal to the Browns. I saw a Browns fan in there saying didn't seem pleased with this move. But again, if you're talking about Tryon-Shoyinka not being a starter and being your number 4 edge, 3 to 4 edge, it's not bad for $4.75 million reclamation project. That's a fine move by the Cleveland Browns. Joins Myles Garrett, Obo Okoronkwo, Alex Wright, Isaiah McGuire, Cam Thomas in their defensive line rotation as of right now.
Yeah, I mean it's a solid move. No, it's the right price tag for a guy like athleticism off the charts. Never really translated that athleticism into production at the NFL level. It's the right price for a kick the tires. Let's see if this guy's still got the talent.
Interesting one. He's got over 3,000 career snaps, former first rounder as a starter. Those guys to me usually get a little overrated. I never thought he was a great player. I think he's a fine rotational player, but he's been a starter for a long time. A lot of times just starting and playing that much football gets you a big payday, but NFL doesn't love Tryon-Shoyinka here. So he was a surprise for the Bucs have done a really nice job drafting. Jason Light's done a great job there over the last few years, but that was a surprise first round pick back in 2021 coming off their Super Bowl win. What else we got here?
I don't know. I'm scanning. There's no more news. Nothing's happening.
No other news going on here. Just a reset as well. Don't know if we're going to be back again tonight with a day 2 recap. That did pretty well for us last night. I thought that was a nice way to just kind of reset the day. We're doing more of that today, being here live, hanging out. Tomorrow, regularly scheduled show at 10:30. Thursday, regularly scheduled show at 10:30. I'm wondering, Sam, if we go team by team, AFC and NFC or something tomorrow. We'll talk about it off air, of course, but kind of review what every team did, what we like, what we didn't like about what they've done, what they still have to do. We could probably get some mileage out of that as far as covering every team, because that's what we like to do here on Check the Mic. Make sure every team gets proper love.
It's not shouty show segment, but let me pitch you another line to react to.
Is it Felger?
No. Emmanuel Acho calls losing CJ Gardner-Johnson a gigantic loss for the Eagles. Quote, he's that dude. I have to be worried about the Eagles defensively now. Are you concerned that the loss of CJ Gardner-Johnson has turned one of the best defenses in football into a problem area now?
No.
Okay.
Acho. Just glad Acho's paying attention during free agency here.
You got to be worried about the Eagles defense now.
In Howie we trust. Man. He is that like high energy piece though, right? That you love to have around. That's his second stint in Philly, right? That was the second time they've let him walk, which I thought
he's a good player, and he is by far the finest troll in the NFL. Like, he is an elite level antagonizer and troll and instigator on the field, and there's definitely a huge amount of value for that on a defense. But I am very not worried that the loss of CJ Gardner-Johnson will turn the best defense in football into a problem, into a concern, the way Acho appears to be.
We do have Jeremy Fowler reporting the Cowboys and wide receiver / returner Kevontae Turpin have agreed to a 3-year deal. Do you want to know the agents on the deal?
No.
Okay, me neither.
I don't.
I was going to say, as my headphones fell out, I was going to say the Cowboys aren't making splashy moves because they don't tend to do that. Yeah. But kind of like this one, Turpin's a nice player, especially with the kick return being, more of a thing in today's NFL. Yeah. Osa Odigizua, 4 years, $80 million, kind of looks like a bargain, getting him locked up before he hit free agency. Buy low on a guard, Robert Jones, former starter, right? It's not going to move the needle a ton, but I kind of like the moves that the Cowboys are putting together. Javonte Williams, 1 year, $3 million at the running back position. Nothing splashy because, they're not doing that, but not subtly solid moves, I think, for Dallas. For a team that has
Turpin's a good player. I mean, I think you're right. He with Cordero Patterson getting on now, I think Turpin becomes the best return man in the NFL at a time where they're trying to make the kick return a bigger and bigger thing. So, re-signing him is a good thing. He can be a gimmick player on offense as well. He's not just a return guy, but no problem with that whatsoever. Did you see? I saw what's his name? Charles McDonald saying his favorite thing about these tweets where the agent, deal brought to you by whoever, is it means that the agent had to type out their own @Twitter name before he sent the text to the group chat. Which is kind of funny.
Make sure you tag me in this.
Well, no, because you don't put that because they're just copying and pasting. So you have to do it yourself. You have to be like deal negotiated by @Steve Palazzolo _ of @the 33rd team. Like, you have to send the whole thing in yourself because otherwise they're not going to go looking for it. They're just copying and pasting. They don't have time for that.
I got to be careful because I'm adjacent to the agent mafia here. I'm adjacent. I don't want to piss them off. I kind of get it. I kind of get why Rap Sheet and all those guys are, carrying their water.
The ones at fault. Like, this is what agents should be doing, right? The flaw in this system is the complete abdication of journalistic responsibility in just saying, cool, I will copy and paste that and just tweet it. That's the problem, not that the agents are doing it. Because I'm sure for as long as they have existed, they have always been trying to get this kind of, bump out of journalists. It's just that most of the way, journalists have been like, no. And then somewhere along the line, they decided, you know what, it's worth it. I'm just going to lose all self-respect and integrity in exchange for the scoop.
Our friend Bob Sturm. So I need to know, we're not insiders here, Sam. Our friend Bob Sturm called it out as well, right? The copy and paste, and it's like guy from ESPN, insider from ESPN, insider from NFL, literally has the same exact text.
Right.
From @whoever. So what is the process? So 2 things I need to know. So the process is like, you have a group text that includes Rap Sheet and Schefter and maybe Fowler and Rossini and whoever else but like, you're going to have 6 of them, 8 of them, 2 of them. Like, who's on your group text when you send this stuff out? How do you make the group text, first of all? Secondly, who initiated the throw my at in there? You got to get my at in there. I need credit for negotiating this deal, because there was some tipping point where the first agent got tagged and everybody's like, good idea. I need to get tagged. Tag me in the
Well,
tweet.
I
I
think it's
negotiated the
just
deal.
been I think it's just been an inch by inch process of agents, taking a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. So it starts off with just, hey, here's the details, put it out there. Don't go checking the numbers, right? Just, this is the deal, right?
This is
And
the
then
deal.
once you saw that was sailing through every time, you're like, well, what if we tack on to the bottom of the text, deal negotiated by, right? Let's see if I can get some credit for this. And then all of a sudden, that's just getting copied and pasted. You're like, well, if I'm going to do that, I might as well tag myself in it. So let's put the Twitter handle in there as well. Boom, that's going flying up as well. So this is just inch by inch, right? Agents are just, you give them an inch, they're taking a mile, and this is just happening year after year.
I don't want to criticize people that I might need to rely upon in the future. If I want to get that GM job, Sam, you never know. I might need one of these guys repping me, getting me into the building, getting in there for some interviews.
We're being asked why we're so vocal about this year. We've been bitching about this for years.
Yeah. It just gets worse. It's just gotten worse and worse. The very worst part is the commentary where it's like, so and so average player was injured and his teammates love him, and it's like you're literally copying and pasting whatever the agent wants to tell you.
Yeah.
Mr. Insider, sir. You're creating this entire narrative. Forget the fake money's one thing. Throwing his Twitter handle in there is another thing. Fine. But like when you're creating a legitimate narrative, oh, he's the best special teamer, teammates love him, he's on his 5th team in 6 years, but everybody wants him. Like, come on, dude. That's too much. It's just too much. You can get really
it's
good
not even
analysis from us instead.
the agent thing is the most obvious platform, or the most obvious avenue that this manifests itself in. But there's been a general trend amongst these news breaking guys generally where they're no longer interested in, like, they're not trying to relay facts. They're not trying to report anymore. What they are trying to do is to just be first to any information, any story. Yeah. So they are becoming pipelines for propaganda, right? Like they're being, oh, look, this guy's told me something. This is new information. I'm putting it out there. The original journalistic approach to that would be, this guy's told me something. I don't know if this story is the real story. So now I'm going to attack it from the other angle, get a second source, cross-reference them, get a better idea of what the actual truth is, and then relay that information. Nobody's got time for that crap anymore in this world of instant news breaking insider reactions. So what happens is, this dude just told me something, I'm tweeting it, and that's the story now. So it's ceased to become journalism, and it's become something different. I don't even know what the correct description of it is, but most of these guys went to some form of journalism school. Like, they have been educated in this ethical world of how to present this information. And somewhere along the line, they all just went, don't care anymore.
Oh yeah. Nobody cares about that. We do have people like Bert Breer, our friend Ari, coming out with the actual corner market, right? So Breer and Ari both coming out with similar ideas here at the same time. After seeing the final numbers from yesterday, the cornerback market, Byron Murphy with the Vikings, Carlton Davis with the Patriots, Paulson Adebo with the Giants, Travarius Ward with the Colts, all signed 3-year, $54 million contracts. So again, the reports were 22 million per year, and 60 million, 66 million, and 64 million, whatever. They're all pretty much 3-year, $54 million contracts for a lot of those top corners off the board. Both Albert Breer and Ari Meirov both coming up with that around the same time here over the last couple minutes. So you start to get more of the truth behind some of the numbers here in day 2 and 3. Do you think anything that's been reported over the last couple days does not come true tomorrow? Does anybody back out? I can't remember in recent years if this has happened, but the historic times we've seen. I remember Frank Gore backed out on the Eagles. Anthony Barr backed out on the Jets and re-signed with the Vikings. There's probably a few others that I can't remember. Do you think any of these do not become official tomorrow?
I mean, there's no reason to think any of them would, but any of them would fail to materialize. And the fact that you can name 2 since this has started leads me to say the numbers suggest no.
We'll be here to react to it if we do, if it does. Any questions from the chat? Any teams you want us to discuss? Do you want to go team by team tomorrow, Sam?
I don't know. Maybe
AFC and NFC reviewing free agency. Hit all the big news up top
across the 2 days, like Wednesday and Thursday.
Yeah, like Wednesday, one day AFC, one day NFC. Every team gets a little bit of a review, reset where their maybe their draft needs land after free agency. We can kind of discuss every team.
Yeah, perhaps.
Good idea. Is that what people want? Falcons. Discuss the Falcons. And Christian Fulton, too. So Ron Carter's asking about the Falcons. They haven't done much. They've lost Grady Jarrett. Haven't spent a whole lot of money. They brought in somebody today. Divine Diablo, linebacker from the Raiders. 2 years, $14 million. It's fine. And then is Jake Matthews just the most quietly dependable player in the NFL? He's just been sitting there starting at left tackle across multiple coaches and systems and everything. He's just playing left tackle for the Falcons. And they re-upped him at the beginning of free agency, 2 years, $45 million.
Yeah, and a former, top 10 draft pick, like highly touted guy coming in. I mean, he might be. Like, he's just had like 10 years of consistent, very good, arguably not great, but like very good.
You're never listing him in the top
maybe that. No, but like he's never been
tackle
in the top 3 offensive tackles in the NFL, but he's always been in the top half.
Yeah. Just the most dependable, quiet. Oh, yeah, Jake Matthews still the left tackle for the Falcons. So that's my Falcons analysis. Who's the other team? Oh, Christian Fulton signed with the Chiefs. Kind of like that move, cornerback depth. And, I think they're pretty heavy on – they had that injury last year at the cornerback position, and I thought that hurt their defense for a stretch right before they got into the playoffs. I think the cornerback depth is huge in Kansas City. I still like Christian Fulton. Like him as a man coverage type of corner, and they like to man up quite a bit. So Trent McDuffie, Christian Fulton, Jalen Watson, Joshua Williams, Nazeed Johnson, they've got some pretty good depth there.
Going back to the Falcons thing for a second, what do you think happens with Kirk Cousins now? So they're in this world where they signed him this time a year ago. They drafted his successor, and then because of the way Kirk Cousins ended up playing during the season, they end up effectively turning the keys over to Michael Penix Jr. late in the season, and Cousins now becomes this massively overpaid backup, but a massively overpaid backup who might not be a great guy to have around as a backup, just in terms of what he brings to the table. On the other hand, you've got a staff there that doesn't necessarily feel in love with the idea of like acknowledging publicly how bad an error it was to sign him in the first place. So they might be prepared to kind of eat the deal and keep him around as this high-paid backup. But since then, Cousins has requested and gotten a meeting with Arthur Blank, the billionaire, and has been like, hey, how about you let me go somewhere else? How do you think that ends up going?
He's got a no trade, right? I believe. So I think
that's presumably one that he can waive.
I keep hearing, and I agree with this, he doesn't want to go anywhere until after the draft. Like, he doesn't want to get... Now, you're running out of teams where this is even going to matter, right? Who actually needs a quarterback? Giants and Steelers. And
but it's also it's the same kind of question with Anthony Richardson, with maybe like how many teams would even contemplate starting Kirk Cousins after last season?
Not many. I mean, so, and then he doesn't want to go to Tennessee, and then they draft Cam Ward, and the same thing that happened last year happens.
Right.
So if he waits until after the draft and Tennessee decides, oh yeah, we're not going Cam Ward, we're just, I don't know what we're drafting Abdul Carter instead, and then he goes to he becomes a starter in Tennessee. But there's no team options. Jets are another fair point, but at this point, if you're the Jets in rebuild mode, do you really want old man Cousins coming in when you could actually just see what, Justin Fields is still a little mystery boxish. You don't know what you could get out of him. So if you're a rebuilding Jets team, I don't think you want Kirk. So he's going to want to go somewhere where he can start. and we're running out of teams where he can start. So he might actually be stuck in Atlanta, or they're just going to flip him to go be a backup in somewhere else, and he just kind of knows what he's getting into as a backup.
There's also, yeah, I mean, there's also sort of like how much the picture changes depending on his contract. Like, I think again, like I don't know that you want Cousins' noodle arm playing in the Meadowlands or in Cleveland, right? Having said that, those are two of the options where he, if his contract wasn't what it is right now, would actually have a halfway decent shot of starting. Like,
Yeah.
if the Browns, if Kirk Cousins' contract was very little, the Browns all of a sudden, I think, would probably get quite interested because right now he'd be the best quarterback on their roster. But they're not trading for him with the contract that he has right now. Like, they would need him to get cut in order for them to get interested. And even then, Cousins would have to be willing to accept that kind of contract, which may not happen. Similarly, like the Jets, would they want to trade for him? No. If he got cut tomorrow, would the Jets be interested? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, man. Like, before the Colts got Daniel Jones, I just keep wanting to put Cousins in a dome because that's where he's been the last 8 years and in better situations. And, he's not a elevate the rest of the squad type of guy. But if he was in Indy, he's not as cheap as Daniel Jones, though, right? That's the thing. And he would go in there and it'd be like, hey, Kirk, you're competing with Anthony Richardson, who we really want to win the job. Like, we really hope Anthony Richardson's better in year 3, and we hope he wins. So he wouldn't want to go there. So there's not a great fit. So he might get stuck. So I think what ultimately happens is there's no starting opportunities unless there's some offseason injury. Atlanta's and then the choice is going to be either sit here in Atlanta as the backup or go be a backup somewhere else. We'll let you choose your spot. And he's going to analyze, because he always analyzes everything, everything to the detail. He's going to find the most injury-prone quarterback that he could go back up. So he's got the best chance of starting, and that's what he's gonna go do.
And he's going down in the sports business Hall of Fame, the way he's managed his career. But it hasn't always been by taking the most money, interestingly. Like, when he signed with Minnesota, he apparently turned down a bigger offer from the Jets to go to Minnesota because he was aware of things like dome versus not, situation around him, those kinds of things. So it doesn't necessarily follow that just because, if he got cut, he would go to the place that's offering him the most money. Like, he might be willing to take a smaller, more modest contract for a place that might give him a shot or a better opportunity to potentially start. So it would be interesting to see if he does get released. Now, if they cut him post June 1st, it's a ton of dead cap money, which would be a problem, but it does save them all the cash, right? Like, they have to eat 40 million of dead cap.
Spreads it out, though, if it's after June 1st.
Right. But if they basically can't cut him with a June 1st designation.
Yeah. Look, it ends up being a difficult spot for Atlanta, even though I think I've defended them as much as anybody because they were aggressive and found their next quarterback. You lose a little bit of the rookie quarterback bump with Michael Penix, but by year 3 of Michael Penix, you'll be able to enjoy that, I think. So I think they found their guy, and ultimately that's the most important thing, even though they, doubled up at the quarterback position with Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix.
But the fact that Kirk Cousins is sort of still on this roster is why I think the Falcons are quiet right now. Like, they're pretty tight against the cap. They don't they're in a reasonably tough spot because they kind of paid Kirk Cousins reasonable money, and he's now not the starting quarterback. They've got another quarterback, so they're not going to be active in free agency because they just don't have the resources right now.
The biggest story for Atlanta, because they have some of the lowest draft capital in the NFL as well, fewest picks and lowest value picks. The big story is their dependence on last year's draft class. They drafted 3 defensive linemen, massive need. All of the guys got hurt last year. Braylon Trice, Ruka Rororo. They need all those guys to be contributors this year, and they still probably need to add first-round edge rusher, whatever it might be. So this draft is big for them, but in a different way from San Francisco. It's in a low volume. You probably need to find some contributors because you're kind of up against it from a resource perspective. But I think the offense is very much intact, minus center. Once they get the center back, they're all back on offense with the QB that I know Raheem and Zach and all those guys believe in because they drafted him at 8.
They're in a sneaky, tricky position because they just don't have a ton of flexibility. Like they are kind of reliant on hitting a couple of moves pretty quickly. Like we're looking at that group a year ago and we're still saying, man, they could really use like a first round defensive lineman to come in and make an impact. I mean, obviously that's either or one or two of those guys they drafted last year to step up and become that guy. You know, Braylon Trice missed basically making any kind of impact as a rookie. The other guys didn't dominate either. So either one or two of those guys needs to jump forward in year two and put their hand up, or they need somebody else to come in and manufacture that kind of impact as well. But like this was the thing about using number 8 overall on Michael Penix Jr. It's worked out on the one hand because you got to get out from the Kirk Cousins mistake and you can pitch the keys over to a guy that seems to be better than people were giving him credit for at draft time. Remember, I think he finished consensus like number 28 on the big board. So like fringe first rounder, second rounder. He looks better than that already. So on the one hand, it worked in those terms, but the downside of that is you then had to basically shotgun the defensive line after that, draft like 3 players, none of whom made any kind of impact yet. So either that needs to happen now, or you still need to find those players and you don't have money to do it in free agency or a ton of draft capital to make it happen at draft time.
The chat is discussing the great Kyle Pitts.
The great
disappointment after his rookie season in, the debate about first round tight ends and everything. I always saw Pitts as a unique case because I don't think he's a pure tight end, and he has outside receiver skills, but maybe not enough to do that full time. And so I think it's more the hybrid aspect of his game that makes him the difficult player that he's been. Multiple systems now where he is not. You have multiple coaching staffs that haven't truly been able to unlock Kyle Pitts properly. And but if you want to call him a tight end, then you go back historically and how many tight ends break out in year 4, 5, and 6. It's similar to the offensive line thing where tight ends do better at that point in their career. That's why I'd say I would buy low on Michael Mayer from the Raiders, buy low on Kyle Pitts if I'm another team, and Atlanta with their desperate need for draft picks, even if it is a 4 or 5, would you buy low on Kyle Pitts if you're another team?
I mean, I would always, like, I'm so suckered in by the potential of what Kyle Pitts could be. I would be kicking the tires on him until his NFL career is done, basically. When 6'6", 245 pounds, who can run a 4.4, 4.40. I mean, that alone is a freaky combination that suggests absurd skills. And that wasn't like his broad jump was off the charts. Like a lot of the other things athletically were extremely good as well. What is, I think, interesting is, so when he came into the league, it's like, is he a tight end? Is he a guy that can play X wide receiver as well? Is he some kind of true hybrid? I don't think you see evidence of him playing to 4.44 speed. Like, I think he's obviously athletic for a tight end, but I'm not looking at him immediately saying, put that guy out at X wide receiver. Look at that speed. Like, he's blazing. He could play that. Maybe he's just miscast. Like, actually play him as a wide receiver. I'm not seeing like devastating speed for that size.
That was what we talked about with Matt Jones the other day when we were throwing back to the 2005 draft when the Jags drafted Matt Jones, who ran in the 4.3s at 6'6". But when you watch him, it's like it's build up speed. It's not twitchy. It's not dynamic really, and it doesn't play on the field. That's part of the issue. And I think there's just the tight end is such an interesting position because I think athleticism matters a ton. Historically, it does. Like, it's hard to be a bad athlete and be good at tight end, but it's not a pure just put an athlete out there and they'll be great. It's such a field position. The number of routes that you have to understand leverage, sit in a zone. You want the versatility to stretch the seam, but you have to know when to bend it, when to stay, when to keep it wide. You have to have such a feel for the position in the middle of the field. And I think that's what might separate, some tight ends. And again, does that take time? I saw the chat also talking about David Njoku. Like, he took some time, 3 or 4 or 5, where he became a pretty good player. So I like the idea of a buy low on Pitts if Atlanta would be willing to get rid of him. And I only brought up Michael Mayer. I'm not saying the Raiders should get rid of him. I'm saying if I'm another team, I would call and say, hey, you're a new coaching staff. How much are you going to use Michael Mayer? You have Brock Bowers. They're not really redundant, but if you're not going to, run a lot of 12, 2 tight end personnel, we'll take Michael Mayer for a later draft pick. He might be a better fit somewhere else as a future starter. So those are the types of moves I think shrewd GMs are thinking about, is the ability to buy low on players that you can, still tap into some of their potential.
And the reason I think where Pitts is interesting is because that's a potential way of manufacturing more flexibility, right? If you could trade away Kyle Pitts, if somebody is willing to give you something for him, that gets you an extra draft pick for a guy you haven't really been able to unlock or maximize in your offense anyway. So like that would be an interesting, way of potentially getting some more flexibility.
Our friend Nate Tice has been running the propaganda for all the blocking tight ends around the NFL that have been getting paid. So not a ton of money, but they're getting paid. Old school, football guy, rooting for the blocking tight ends.
Ben Hartsock Appreciation Society.
Oh man, I still hear Ben on the college Sirius NFL Sirius College channel. He's on there for them. Every now and again he'll mention his like PFF run blocking grade. I think we may, I don't even know, I don't think he believed he was as good as PFF told him. Like I think he was still surprised every now and again that we had him ranked so high as a run blocker. And because that was the old plus minus system, he was like the best tight end in the NFL before we had to say, hey, wait, we don't really want the run blocking tight end to look the best. We're just adding up the numbers. Good old Ben Hartsock. That's the story. That's the story there. What else we got here, man? Micah Parsons has chimed in. So in response to the Niners releasing Leonard Floyd, Clarence Hill Jr. says 49ers gutting themselves. And then Micah Parsons quote tweets that and says, no more rookie quarterback. Welcome to reality. So even the NFL players, they understand the rookie contract edge and how that affects the money.
Micah Parsons is a low-key, like, ball knower. Micah Parsons was calling out somebody the other day for like, Debo gets traded for a fifth and somebody else gets traded for this. Like, this is ridiculous. And he was like, no, like, look at the contracts that are being traded here. It's not the same thing. It's not apples to apples. Like, number one, he's right. And number two, it's just kind of funny that the player knows that and the guy, that's calling it out is not. Like, Michael Parsons knows what he's talking about in a lot of instances.
He does. Yeah, I completely agree. Should have Micah. Can we get Micah on the show? All right. Do you want to read out this question?
From Andrew Moorman in the chat. Steve and Sam, what the hell are the Eagles going to do at safety? Is this a prelude to trading up for Starks because you can't have an Eagles draft without a Georgia player in round one?
Well, they already have Ed Reed Blankenship.
Yep.
And I think they're going to start believing in Sidney Brown heading into year 3 being a starter here. So I think Sidney Brown, Reed Blankenship is the 1-2 punch at safety. Speaking of buy lows, Lewis Seen is on the roster. It's the right system for Lewis Seen. Georgia safety. But I don't think they trade up from Malachi Starks. I think a bigger issue is when you look at replacing Milton Williams and Josh Sweat. And they've already started some of that over the last couple of years. Nolan Smith is there. Jalix Hunt had a really nice year as a rookie. Bryce Huff. But could they use another edge? Absolutely. Milton Williams out. Do they still have Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Moro Ojomo? Yes. Do they need more? Yes. Do they want more? Yeah. I think their first 2 picks are defensive linemen, and they're not going to go safety. That's my thought. I think
that makes sense.
Edge and defensive tackle, first 2 picks for the Eagles. I would not be surprised. Maybe they go guard, but I think they're going back to the trenches. They just drafted corners with their first 2 picks last year. They're, Howie's twitching right now to draft an offensive or a defensive lineman in the first 2 rounds. That's what's happening.
Lewis Seen, I thought he would be really good. Like very early in his career, he got that horrible leg injury against the Saints. Was it on the kickoff coverage or something? Like his knee or his leg, just like it was awful. Like one of those horrific career-changing leg injuries. And he's never gotten back to being anything like the same guy. But that's one where, like at draft time, my level of confidence that Lewis Seen would be a good NFL safety was really high. And like the guy is now just clicking onto roster spots.
I know. I thought he'd be good too. The injury stuff and how that affects speed, and and he may have just never been a good player either, but he's never really
Right.
had the opportunity, and it's really tough to gauge what went wrong. Every time you're evaluating draft prospects, we love to go back and what did I miss and what went wrong and whatever it might be. It's really tough to unpack that specifically with seeing because of the injury and the timing of everything.
Those are always the really difficult ones where it's like I don't like it, you have to basically put a pin in it and be like, there's no way of knowing. Like, was he going to be a bad NFL player, or was he going to be a good NFL player and an injury that was horrific, like basically ruined his career? There's just no way of knowing what the answer to that question is. So you have to kind of shelve those guys and be like, I literally can't learn anything about the process by this outcome because the confounding variable is so big and it changes everything.
We'll take a few more questions and we could probably wrap it up, Sam. What do you think?
All right.
Take a few more questions from the chat. Enjoying hanging out. Not a ton of breaking news while we've been over here, but Barry in the chat's asking, an interesting show would be going through players we missed and speculate on why. I mean, I could touch on that a little bit now. We always mentioned who's the biggest miss. I always mentioned Vernon Hargraves.
Yeah.
You might call it Brian Thomas Jr. now, the other way.
Right.
I think I have a lot of thoughts on hits and misses and how we should think about them, though.
I mean, I think if you're not looking back on the ones you screwed up and asking why, you're not trying to get better. I think there is a variety of different reasons you can miss, and each player is slightly different. I mean, I think so Brian Thomas Jr. falls into the category of a couple of things. Number one, I think I didn't give him enough appreciation for the fluidity of movement at that size. Like his straight line speed, all those things was pretty obvious. I didn't give him enough credit for like how fluid he is at that size and how the horizontal short area stuff. And then number two, it was a big amount of projection of, well, he's running a very vertical route tree in college. Can he run a more diverse route tree at the NFL? And what does that look like? To me, I think we've seen so many of those guys who run a very vertical oriented route tree not do it to the next level that I basically at that point written off projecting that as a concept. Right. And there are people who go, well, that's a team failing, not a Brian Thomas Jr. failing. Like, why would you not assume he can do that? Because we've seen too many players that couldn't, right? Remember Corey Coleman, who's just been named an assistant coach at TCU. Corey Coleman ran an extremely Spartan route tree. It was like goes, it was slants, it was very little else, right? Because he came from that Baylor offense where they don't need them running that much. You're like, well, look at the athleticism, the dynamism, the explosiveness, all this stuff. As soon as you get him running an NFL route tree, Corey Coleman becomes this elite level number one wide receiver. And it never happened. He was never able to do that. And so Corey Coleman is immediately a bust, bombs out of the league, and the guy's now an assistant coach. So it's not as simple as being like, well, this is what the team asked him to do. Of course he can do more. That stuff falls into the category of we don't know one way or the other, and you have to make a call. Do you think he can based off the traits you're seeing? And it's educated guessing. And that's true for wide receivers. It's true. Like each player usually has something like this where you have to make a call on it, right? Shedeur Sanders, the call is he's got some troubling behavior under pressure, but the Colorado offensive line is terrible and his pass protection is bad and the offense didn't help him out. So what happened is that how much of that is him and how much of that is the system around him, right? And none of us know, and we all have to basically draw a line on the pie chart. Where does that fit? And if it's a small amount for Shedeur, you're going to like him. You're going to want him in the top couple of picks. If it's a small amount for the offense and you think it's mostly Shedeur, you probably don't want to touch him in the first round. And that's why we're all watching the same tape. And the difference in projection is, I would take him in the top of the draft versus I don't even have a first round grade on the guy. I think that's possible by watching the same tape because this is an unknown variable that has no answer to it. And you have to guess. So I think a lot of players have stuff like that. And the answer is like, you projected that thing wrong, right? You thought it was a bigger piece or a smaller piece. And actually the truth is ended up being the opposite.
So I always put quarterbacks in a whole different world when it comes to the evaluation process. You know that. So like, let's take that out of it for a second. The Brian Thomas Jr. thing's interesting because I think evaluating your misses, if you have a process, I think evaluating your misses is overrated. So if you have a true process, Sam, and you watch receivers the same way every year, and however you evaluate them, if you're consistent with it, and then you come back and you say, I put Brian Thomas Jr. into the same bucket as Gabe Davis and I don't know, 10 other receivers. And the first 9 were all misses, and then Brian Thomas Jr. is a hit, and you miss it. And the people in the chat remind you all the time, Sam. And you know how we're like D-level public figures, Sam. So we have people jump into the chat, be like, are these the same people who had this one take that I hated 4 years ago? Oh yeah, I hate these people because they had a bad take. Somebody's going to call you out if you're Brian Thomas Jr. Dismissing his skill set. But if he's the one hit out of 10 in your process historically, I don't think you learn anything from that. You just say it's 1 out of 10. And that's it. I don't think you missed anything. I think it's just the law of averages worked against you that one time. And if you say in your head, I thought this was Corey Coleman or Gabe Davis or John Ross or whoever else, and you were right the first 9 times, and the 10th one's Brian Thomas Jr. Because I hear evaluators talk about this all the time. You got to learn from your misses and everything. I think it's very self-centered to learn from your misses if you don't understand what a good baseline of success is. Now, if you always missed, if you missed on, I mean, if you start stacking up all your receiver takes and it's like, man, it was Zay Flowers and it was Brian Thomas Jr. and it was Mingo and I'm just, both of us had similar takes on these guys, right? And if you always are off on something, then maybe we reevaluate how you evaluate that position or whatever. You know what I mean? That's how I think evaluators, Mike T says this all the time, right? He's like, he always makes fun of himself for drafting Vernon Golston and bringing that up. And so if every time a player has a great workout, it's like stuck in his head because he's got this, PTSD about drafting Vernon Golston, he might miss on some good players who happen to be workout warriors, but are also good players. Like what was the miss there? Is that Vernon Golston was a bad football. Wasn't that you drafted a workout warrior? It was that you drafted a bad football player who happened to be a workout warrior, right? So you have to kind of connect those dots properly.
Well, that's why, I think number one is you need to understand why the guy busted, right? And as we've already said with a guy like Lewisine, sometimes the answer to that is I don't know, right? Lewisine, I do not know if we had a bad evaluation or if a terrible leg break really early in his career torpedoed his career. So that one, I think you basically have to throw out and say, I have no idea, right? There are other guys where there are things that you couldn't have known, and that's the reason he busted, right? Like it's a character thing, or it's some other red flag, or it turns out that like he doesn't show up to any meetings and he doesn't know the playbook, and you hear that after the fact once he's bombed out of his first NFL team or whatever. You're like, there was no way we could have known that, and even if we didn't have an inside source, we wouldn't even know that now. So like those guys almost get thrown out as well, because like that falls into the category of information that I wasn't privy to, which is the reason that he's failed at this level. So number one is correctly identifying why you were off in the first place, right? Why did a guy fail, or why did a guy succeed? Why didn't I have that information at the time? Was it something that you could have known? And then so then I think the sort of final part of that is, well, is this a failing of what I was doing, or is this just sometimes information is different, or sometimes the low level percentage thing hits, right? And again, I know you isolate quarterbacks, but they're kind of useful for some of these things because of the way it works. Like,
yeah, you're still allowed to talk about them. That's fine. Go ahead.
Josh Allen, right? Each one of us said that Josh Allen effectively hit the 99th percentile of his range of outcomes, right? Each one of us acknowledged that was in his range of outcomes. We were like, I mean, we literally, my metaphor at the time was he's this IKEA quarterback, right? There is an amazing quarterback in a box constructed with all these tools, the arm, the body size, the athleticism, all this stuff. It's in the box, but you need to figure out how to put it all together, because right now it's just a bag of bits. It's not a fully fledged NFL quarterback. So even that analogy was acknowledging that within there is the pieces, the requisite parts for him to become the player that he's become. But it seemed very unlikely given the track record of like very big tools, but not good football players at that time, right?
Right. So my point on this is if you in your quarterback evaluations put Josh Allen in the same bucket as, I'm just pulling names, right? Blaine Gabbert, Jake Locker, and then Josh Allen comes along and you're like, this is all the same guy. And historically this never works. And then it works.
Yeah.
And then the fourth guy comes along and it looks just like Josh Allen. It's Anthony Richardson comes along, right? And now your Anthony Richardson evaluation is skewed. Like, I don't want this to happen again. I don't want to miss on the next Josh Allen because he's athletic and he's huge and he's got a cannon. And Allen figured it out, and now Richardson can figure it out. So I'm going to say he can figure it out because Josh Allen did. Instead of saying I was 1 for 5 previously, and I think Richardson's also going to miss too. You know, whatever it is, just as long as you're consistent and not skewed by the outliers. Don't be skewed by the outliers is my suggestion here.
Yeah.
And when people say they study their misses, theoretically they're talking about their outliers, unless you just always miss.
Right. But it's like a two-pronged thing, right? Like the first question is, was I effectively off in terms of the Josh Allen projection? Forget the analysis, like the fact that, you know, we acknowledge that within there was an outcome somewhere where Josh Allen became what he became. Like neither one of us were Josh Allen believers. Let's put it that way, right? So were we wrong with our Josh Allen projection? Yeah, I think that's reasonable to say. But was it wrong to the point where, given what we know now, and you go back and do it again, would we project the same thing? Like, probably. Like, that's the point. Like, were you wrong in a way that you should change what your projection would be at the time, given the information available? And I think the answer to that with Josh Allen is no, because though he hit the 99th percentile of his range of outcomes, that's an extremely unlikely thing to happen. So just because it happened once doesn't mean, as you said, that then becomes the default that every toolsy quarterback who can, you know, there's a 99th percentile outcome where he looks like a superstar, that's now your default approach. You still aim for the middle of the bell curve, which would say most of those guys are probably not going to work out. Although, you know, we've seen guys that do, and that should color at least your interpretation or your description of them. But that's, I think, the problem is that people can get the first part sometimes. I missed because of X. But as you say, then they go, well, then I need to completely overcorrect and go,
right,
because of that. And it's really difficult, right? Like I'm now, because of guys like Corey Coleman, I'm spooked of these guys that don't run full NFL route trees, and you need to project like Luther Burden this year. I'm scared of the projection involved in Luther Burden. Talent-wise, I love what he can do with the football, but there's not nearly as much of him running some NFL concepts as there are other players. And to project him, you know, as a high first-round draft pick or whatever is a lot scarier than with some other guys. But that leads you to overcorrect and to go, well, Brian Thomas Jr. only ran X, Y, and Z in college, so I'm going to say he's only a vertical threat. He's Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He's not going to make a big impact. And then the dude looks like the best receiver from this draft class.
We have almost 1,000 people watching here live. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. We're going to be wrapping it up here a little soon, but we're closing in, Sam. Closing in on 35,000 subscribers. Just started this channel back in August, so shout out to our subscribers and those who don't subscribe. If you guys, you know, want to join the fun with Check the Mic. We've been starting this thing. We started this thing from scratch back in August. Appreciate all of the people who have joined us. So if you don't mind hitting the subscribe button, joining us to continue this journey, especially here in the off season, would love it. We're trying to get to 35K, and we love doing this off season chatter, evaluation chatter, draft, free agency, team building. My favorite time of the year, Sam. So hope you'll continue to join us, get us to 35K and beyond over here on Check the Mic. Let me ask you this one, Sam. CJ Stroud. I made a comparison for fear of alienating Houston Texans fans here. Coming out, I'm beyond my QB evaluations. I don't care. Okay being wrong, okay being right, doesn't matter. Nobody's good at it. Repeated. Said CJ Stroud reminded me a little bit of Derek Carr as a player, where I felt like circumstances would dictate things a little bit, right? When he had good circumstances, he could have high-end seasons. When he had less than stellar circumstances, maybe not as great. let's try to set aside the fact that Derek Carr has like the most losses through 6 seasons, 7 seasons, 8 seasons. I think that stat is more circumstantial than anything. It doesn't mean he's the worst quarterback of all time. It means he's good enough to start and he's been on some bad teams, right? That's the Derek Carr stat. I don't think Stroud's going to do that. He's won a lot of games so far. But am I wrong after 2 years to compare that? And I don't even care. I'm not even clinging to the take. I don't even care. But after year one, I may have thought I was an idiot, right? I mean, look at how good Stroud is. He looks like the next star. But if we're honest about Derek Carr's career, there was a point after his second year where that looked like the case too. Or his third year, 2016, he was outstanding, Derek Carr. And he looked like the next star, perennial top 10 quarterback. And he's had probably 2, 3, 4 years where he's been a top 10 quarterback. Other years, he's been closer to 10 to 15. Is that an unfair comp to CJ Stroud after 2 years where he was outstanding as a rookie and not as good? Not good at all last year, by the way, CJ Stroud. He was not good at all. And I know the situation was bad, but he was not good at all.
Yeah, he wasn't. It was a very bad situation between losing receivers, the offensive line being an absolute mess, the offense seeming to run out of answers, some potential interpersonal friction, within that dynamic as well. Like the whole thing wasn't good. So I'm not saying you give him a pass, but I think there's a lot of explanations for why he took a big step back last year.
And I would say, by the way, if I was to correct that right now, I think he'll have a better career than Derek Carr. I think through 2 years, I would say there's been far more good than bad, and he will, be better than Derek Carr. But that was my initial take, and through 2 years, it's like, is it that far off? It's not. I don't think that's like an insult to even put them in a similar bucket right now.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like overall, this sort of weird amorphous concept of just good. Like, how good were you on a scale of 1 to 10, right? Or in PFF's terms, on a scale of 0 to 100, how good were you? In those broad terms, yeah, I think they might belong in the same bucket. But in terms of like how that's comprised, I think they appear to be very different players right now. Like Derek Carr, the thing that has always held him back in a lot of people's eyes is it feels like there's something missing, that like innate sense of playing the game and understanding the big moments and like all the kind of intangible stuff that it's very difficult to quantify or to pin down, but like tends to manifest in, third down performance or those types of things, right? Derek Carr's always felt a little bit more random than that. It's like, I focused on the deep ball at one point. Like he knows he should attempt a certain percentage of deep balls to like back a defense off him, but it doesn't seem to be as strategic or as tactical rather than as some other quarterbacks who understand when to go deep based off what, the defense is showing them. Carr's just like, I'm due a deep ball at this point, so I'm going to heave one to Amari Cooper and hopefully that'll do the trick. Whereas CJ Stroud, even in the bad year, felt like he was coming up big in the big moments, right? Felt like he had the feel of when the game needed him. And that was when he was going to find a play and make something happen. Now, maybe he lent into that too much and that started to become a problem. But I think generally they're very different players, even if like overall that might each end up as an 80 overall PFF grade.
I agree with that. Stylistically, I think they're very different. Stylistically, they're absolutely different. I think that does matter in this discussion. But I just thought that was interesting, right? Because, in the chat reminds too, like, hey, should we pump the brakes on Jaden Daniels after 1 year because of Stroud? And I'm all about slow playing praise, right? We were ready to establish Jordan Love as the next top 5 quarterback, and Trevor Lawrence looked like he was finally ready to become the next top 5 quarterback, and they didn't necessarily, right? It's not linear progression. So evals are fun, player evals are fun, draft evals, love discussing those. Anything else before we wrap it up here, Sam?
No, other than, we would just caution, forget like a sophomore slump for quarterbacks. Just one sample size for anything one season of sample size for anything in the NFL is very flimsy. I mean, we've seen good and bad season-long sample sizes. You know that is a risky thing to be basing like your entire analysis on. Guys have amazing seasons, guys have poor seasons. Maybe that'll be who they are, but we've seen all sorts of those guys revert, year to year.
I see the discussion as well, right? Hey, Jaden Daniels has Deebo Samuel coming in and Laramie Tunsil. Well, last year at this time, CJ Stroud had Laramie Tunsil, by the way, and had Stephon Diggs coming in, and boy, was I like, man, they were in the Final Four last year with C.J. Stroud as a rookie, and now they add Stephon Diggs. They're going to be able to compete with the Bills, the Chiefs, the Ravens. Thought the Bengals might make a Super Bowl run. Hey, they were in the Final Four again, but the Texans were a step below, I think, this year, even where they were last year, because of the O-line and or play calling or whatever was going on. The injuries wasn't as good as we thought it could be, even though offseason I thought Houston made a lot of good moves. So you just never know how it's all going to work out. Tomorrow, 10:30 a.m., we're going to be live. So it's your usual Wednesday and Thursday. Usual check the mic off-season schedule, 10:30 Wednesday, 10:30 Thursday. Appreciate everybody for being here. Be sure to, once again, hit the thumbs up, do the subscribe, do all the things. Don't know if any of this goes out into audio land. We'll figure all that out if you're there, if you listen to it as well in audio. Anything else here, Sam, before we shut her down?
No.
All right, we'll be back with any live reaction if any of the other big news breaks. Appreciate everybody for joining us. We'll see you again tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. Check the mic.